I am Abigail, 30 years old, and today I dismantled my entire family's fraudulent empire. It started when my sister told me not to come home for Christmas Eve, saying my presence would only make everyone uncomfortable. So I spent Christmas Eve alone in my apartment. But just a few hours later, my parents called me, their voices trembling, asking what was all over the news. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The ping of the family group chat echoed through my silent office. It was 4 in the afternoon on Christmas Eve. I picked up my phone expecting a question about dinner. Instead, a message from my older sister Penelope glared back at me. Desmond is hosting his biggest investors tonight, her message read. Your cheap clothes and boring number-crunching stories will kill the vibe. Do not come. Another notification popped up. It was an audio message from my brother-in-law Desmond, an African-American former professional football player who rebranded himself as a venture capitalist. I tapped play, and his booming laugh filled my quiet office. Yeah, Abby, we are serving Wagyu beef tonight. Desmond chuckled. I will cash app you $50 so you can order a lonely pizza. A third message arrived from my mother Diane. She certainly did not reprimand them. Listen to your sister Abigail, my mother wrote. You are always so negative. Use tonight to reflect on why you are 30 and alone instead of ruining Penelope's perfect evening. I sat back in my chair. I did not cry. The sting of their cruelty was deeply familiar. It was exactly like the time I won an academic scholarship. Penelope had thrown a massive tantrum, so my parents hosted a catered birthday party for her poodle on the exact same night. They spent my entire life making me feel invisible while treating Penelope and Desmond like royalty. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed my career was just low-level data entry. They had no idea that I was a lead forensic accountant working for a federal contractor. And they had no idea what was currently displayed on my right monitor. It was a 500-page federal audit report. The bold title page read, Official Investigation into Desmond Callahan and the Green Energy Innovation Fund. For the past 8 months, I had been meticulously tracking every single wire transfer offshore account and fake vendor receipt associated with Desmond's venture capital firm. My brilliant brother-in-law was not a financial genius. He was running a massive Ponzi scheme defrauding elderly investors out of their life savings to fund his luxury cars, Penelope's designer wardrobe, and the extravagant parties they threw. I scrolled to the conclusion section of the massive report. The evidence was irrefutable. Tens of millions of dollars had been illegally laundered. The paper trail was perfectly documented and ready for immediate prosecution. My family thought I was sitting alone feeling sorry for myself. In reality, I was holding the absolute destruction of their entire lives at my fingertips. I picked up my phone and opened the family group chat. I kept my response simple, refusing to give them an emotional reaction. Merry Christmas, I typed and hit send. Then I moved my mouse over to the secure portal on my computer screen. The portal was a direct line to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. I took a deep breath, feeling the heavy weight of mistreatment fall away from my shoulders. I clicked submit. The loading bar filled the screen, turning bright green as the data transfer completed. The files were gone out of my hands and secured into the federal justice system. Immediate warrants would be issued automatically based on the severe flight risk I had flagged. Hours later, the city was dark and remarkably quiet. I was sitting comfortably on the sofa in my apartment wearing loose sweatpants and eating a warm bowl of spicy ramen. The television was playing softly in the background. It was exactly the kind of lonely night my mother had cruelly mocked, but I had never felt more at peace. The silence was not a punishment, it was a beautiful sanctuary. Suddenly, my phone began vibrating violently against the glass coffee table. The caller ID flashed frantically with my father's name, Richard. I let it ring for a few long seconds, slurping some noodles before calmly answering the call. Abigail. My father screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with a terrifying level of panic I had never heard from him before. What is happening? Where are you? I am at home, Dad, I answered evenly. eating noodles just like Desmond suggested. What is wrong? Federal agents just kicked the front doors in. He yelled, the terrible sound of breaking glass and loud shouting echoing clearly in the background. They are everywhere. They are raiding Desmond's mansion. They crashed the holiday party, and they are seizing everything. Turn on the news right now. What is all over the news? The television showed live helicopter footage of their sprawling estate fully illuminated by the flashing red lights of federal vehicles. Armed agents were carrying massive boxes of financial documents out of the grand front door. My father was practically hyperventilating on the phone. You work in finance, Abigail. You are an accountant. Why did you not know about this? Why did you not warn your sister? You are completely useless. I did not warn her, Dad. I said, my voice incredibly steady and freezing cold, because I am the lead forensic investigator. I am the one who sent them. A sharp, breathless gasp came from my mother on the other end of the line, followed quickly by a dead dial tone. I smiled broadly as the night truly started. The icy wind of Christmas Eve bit at my face as I stepped out of my car and walked toward the downtown precinct. The flashing blue and red lights from dozens of police cruisers painted the surrounding buildings in a frantic, pulsating rhythm. I pushed through the heavy double doors, trading the bitter winter air for the suffocating heat and the sharp chemical smell of industrial floor cleaner. The precinct lobby was a chaotic mess of shouting defense attorneys, overworked booking officers, and holiday-drunk drivers arguing with desk sergeants. It only took me 3 seconds to spot my family. They were impossible to miss, sticking out like a sore thumb in the bleak municipal environment. They looked like a luxury fashion magazine advertisement that had been dragged through a muddy alleyway. Penelope sat slumped on a hard plastic bench. Her custom-ordered silk holiday gown was torn at the hem and stained with what looked like red wine and mud. Her perfect salon blowout was a tangled, frizzy disaster. Next to her, Desmond was handcuffed tightly to a metal ring bolted into the wooden seating. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket was gone, leaving him shivering in a rumpled, sweat-stained white dress shirt. My parents, Diane and Richard, were frantically pacing the floor, cornering a tired-looking police officer who was actively ignoring them. The moment my mother turned and saw me standing by the security checkpoint, her panicked expression instantly shifted into one of intense familiar irritation. She marched across the crowded lobby, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the scuffed linoleum. My father followed right on her heels. "Thank goodness you finally decided to show up," my mother hissed, grabbing my arm with bruising force. The feds burst into the house like absolute lunatics. They humiliated us in front of the governor and half the country club board. They dragged Desmond out in handcuffs over some ridiculous tax misunderstanding. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? My father did not even bother with a simple greeting. He reached into his coat pocket and thrust a crumpled bail bond pamphlet directly into my chest. "Desmond has his bail set at $1 million, my father commanded, his face red and sweating. "They require 10% in cash immediately to release him tonight. The banks are closed for the holiday. You need to wire $100,000 to this bondsman right now so we can get out of here." I looked down at the crumpled paper, then back up at my father's demanding expression. "You want me to pay Desmond's bail?" I said, keeping my voice completely flat and deadpan. "Do not play games with me tonight, Abigail," my father snapped, stepping closer to intimidate me. "You live in a cheap little apartment. You buy your clothes off the rack. You never go on vacation, and you spend your entire life hoarding your paycheck. You easily have that much cash sitting in a savings account. Wire the money so we can get your brother-in-law out of this filthy place and salvage what is left of our Christmas Eve." Hearing the commotion, Desmond strained against his handcuffs and leaned forward on the bench. He pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Pay up, you glorified human calculator," he barked, his deep voice carrying over the noise of the lobby. "My personal and business accounts are temporarily frozen because of some idiotic clerical error at the bank. It is a completely standard mix-up, but these overzealous federal agents will not listen to basic reason. Just make the transfer. I will pay your boring little life back on Monday morning with interest." The sheer audacity of his demand washed over me. It did not make me angry. Instead, it brought an incredible sense of cold, crystalline clarity. For my entire life, this was exactly how they had treated me. I was never a beloved daughter or a cherished sister. I was a disposable resource to be tapped, a convenient scapegoat, to take the blame, a dumping ground for their endless mistakes. I slowly pulled my arm out of my mother's tight grip and stepped closer to the bench where Desmond was chained. I looked down at him, studying the genuine panic hiding just behind his arrogant, entitled eyes. "I am not going to pay your bail, Desmond," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quieted section of the lobby. "Just like I am not going to forget what happened 5 years ago." My mother gasped sharply, but I did not stop speaking. "Do you remember that, Desmond?" I asked, leaning in slightly. "5 years ago, when you desperately wanted to project the image of a highly successful venture capitalist, but your credit score was completely destroyed. You stole my social security number to finance a $120,000 Porsche. You committed identity theft and felony fraud against your own sister-in-law just to impress your country club friends." "Keep your voice down, Abigail," my father hissed, looking around nervously at the police officers standing nearby. "That is family business. We handled that situation privately." "You mean you covered it up?" I corrected him, turning to face my father with a glare that made him step back. "You and Mom drained my entire college savings account to pay off the car dealership so the police would not arrest your precious golden son-in-law. You told me that family protects family, and that I was selfish for wanting to press charges. You stole my education to buy his silence and his luxury car. You told me to just take out student loans because I was smart enough to pay them back. Well, the Bank of Abigail is permanently closed. I am not your ATM anymore, Desmond." Penelope suddenly leaped up from her plastic chair. Her face was twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. She stomped over to me, her ruined silk gown dragging heavily on the dirty floor. She shoved her finger into my shoulder. "You are such a jealous, bitter spinster!" Penelope screamed, spraying spittle into the air between us. "You have always been jealous of me. You are jealous of my handsome husband, my incredible wealth, and my beautiful life. You are 30 years old and completely alone, so you want to drag us down into your miserable, lonely existence. You are refusing to help us because you are a sad, pathetic woman who just wants to see my perfect Christmas ruined." She stood inches from my face, her chest heaving with exertion, waiting for me to shatter into tears just like I used to when we were teenagers. She fully expected me to shrink away to apologize for being difficult to yield to her overwhelming main character syndrome. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, genuinely happy smile that caused Penelope to physically flinch and take a step back in pure confusion. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my heavy winter coat. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a credit card or a phone to make a bank transfer. I pulled out a heavy leather wallet and flipped it open, letting it drop to reveal a gleaming gold federal shield and a high-security identification badge. "I am not here to pay his bail." "Penelope," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, stale air of the precinct lobby like a perfectly sharpened blade. "I am the lead forensic investigator the federal government hired to put your husband away." The gold shield glinted brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct lobby. For exactly 3 long seconds, absolute silence reigned among my family members. Then Penelope suddenly burst into a shrill, mocking laugh. She pointed a manicured finger at the badge in my hand, her face twisting into a sneer of pure condescension. "You bought that on the internet," she declared, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You are so obsessed with my life that you concocted this entire pathetic fantasy just to feel important for 5 minutes. "Penelope, shut up!" he hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward the 2 uniformed officers standing near the booking desk. But Penelope was incapable of reading a room. She stepped closer to me, her ruined silk holiday gown rustling against the dirty floor. "I know exactly what this is." Penelope continued, her tone shifting from mocking to deeply patronizing. "You saw Desmond getting arrested on the news, so you rushed down here to gloat. You probably printed that fake identification at a copy shop on your way over. If you do not put that plastic toy away and pay Desmond's bail right now, I am going to tell these officers exactly what you are doing." I stood perfectly still, letting her delusion hang in the stale air. I simply held her gaze with steady, unwavering eye contact. The sheer absurdity of her denial was a testament to how deeply my family had underestimated me. They were so committed to the narrative of my inferiority that they literally could not comprehend reality when it was shoved directly into their faces. My father stepped between us, physically pushing Penelope back. Richard was a man who lived and breathed for optics. He did not care about the truth or the law or even Desmond's impending prison sentence. He only cared about how this would look on the golf course tomorrow morning. Abigail. Whatever sick game you are playing, it stops right this second, my father commanded. He used his heavy corporate executive voice, the tone he reserved for firing subordinates and bullying waiters. Do you have any idea the massive damage this is causing? The governor was at that party tonight. The board members of the Greenwich Country Club were drinking my wine when federal agents kicked the doors down. My reputation is being dragged through the mud on live television, and you are standing here waving a piece of plastic around like a stubborn child. I slipped my badge into my pocket. My reputation is not the one on the line tonight, Dad. I suggest you ask your golden boy son-in-law where the $50 million went. My father did not even look at Desmond. He kept his furious glare locked entirely on me. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored overcoat and pulled out his leather-bound checkbook. The gesture was so ingrained, so fundamentally indicative of how he solved every problem in his life, that I almost laughed. He clicked his expensive fountain pen, resting the checkbook against his palm. I am putting an end to this humiliation right now, my father stated, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I know you are bitter, Abigail. I know you are struggling financially with your little accounting job. I know you resent your sister for marrying well. But you are going to walk over to that desk, tell the officers you made a terrible mistake, and drop whatever ridiculous accusations you have filed against Desmond. He began scribbling aggressively on the top check. I am writing you a check for $100,000, he continued, not looking up from the paper. That is more money than you make in 2 years. Take it. Go buy yourself some new clothes. Take a vacation. Do whatever it is single women do. But you will shred that audit report, and you will never mention this night again. Do not humiliate this family any further. He ripped the check from the binding with a sharp, tearing sound. He held the slip of paper out to me, snapping it between his fingers. It was the ultimate insult. He truly believed my integrity, my federal license, and my entire career could be bought off with the equivalent of his annual country club dues. He believed my demand for justice was just a plea for a handout. I looked at the check fluttering in his tight grip. I looked at Penelope, who was now smiling triumphantly, clearly believing that her father had just successfully purchased my submission. I looked at Desmond, whose eyes were wide with a sudden, desperate hope. Write it, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a dead calm. Write the check. My father scoffed, a short sound of absolute vindication. He shoved the paper directly into my hand. I told you everyone has a price, he muttered, turning to Diane. Now let us get Desmond out of here. This place smells like a subway station. I gripped the edges of the check between my thumbs and forefingers. The paper was thick, expensive stock. I held it up, making sure my father was watching, making sure Penelope and Desmond were watching. I ripped the check straight down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper was louder than anything else in the room. I placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto the scuffed linoleum floor right over my father's expensive leather shoes. My father's jaw dropped. The smug satisfaction vanished from his face, replaced by genuine, unadulterated shock. Penelope gasped, stepping forward as if she might try to catch the falling pieces of paper. What is wrong with you? My father roared, his voice echoing off the walls. That was $100,000. It is going to bounce anyway, I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I froze all of your personal accounts 45 minutes ago. My mother snatched her diamond-encrusted smartphone from her designer handbag so fast she nearly dropped it on the scuffed precinct floor. Her manicured fingers trembled violently as she jabbed at the screen, bypassing her lock screen to open her banking application. For a few agonizing seconds, the little blue loading circle spun in the center of the display. I watched her perfectly lifted face contort as the numbers finally populated. The main checking account showed a red 0. The joint savings account showed a red 0. Her personal emergency fund, the one she always bragged about keeping for rainy days, displayed a bold, glaring red 0. The illusion of their generational wealth, the very foundation of their entire existence, evaporated right there under the flickering fluorescent lights of the downtown police station. Diane let out a sound that was half gasp, half feral shriek. The phone slipped from her grip, clattering against the linoleum. She did not even try to pick it up. Instead, she lunged directly at me. Her hands formed into claws aiming right for my chest. A nearby desk sergeant shouted a warning and started to step out from behind the bulletproof glass, but I simply took one calculated step backward, letting my mother stumble and catch her balance against the edge of the wooden bench. "You vindictive little monster!" Diane screamed, her voice echoing off the concrete walls and drawing the stares of every single person in the lobby. "You did this out of pure, petty spite. You could never stand the fact that Penelope had a beautiful life, a handsome husband, and a mansion while you were rotting away in that depressing little apartment. You have destroyed this family tonight because you are empty inside. You have no husband, you have no children, so you want us to have nothing too. Turn the accounts back on right now before I have you arrested for theft." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet authority I commanded in that moment was far more terrifying to them than any screaming match we had ever engaged in during my childhood. "I did not steal anything. Mother," I said, looking down at her as she clutched the edge of the bench. "I am an agent of the federal government. I secured those accounts because they are holding stolen property. Your precious son-in-law transferred exactly $15 million of elderly investors' retirement funds to an untraceable shell company in the Cayman Islands yesterday afternoon. I tracked the wire through 3 different proxy servers." My father, who had been staring at the shredded pieces of his worthless check on the floor, suddenly snapped his head up. $15 million, he repeated, the color entirely draining from his cheeks. "Yes, Dad," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Diane. $15 million. The Green Energy Innovation Fund was completely insolvent as of last Tuesday. Desmond knew the quarterly dividend checks were going to bounce next week. He knew the investors would start demanding audits, so he initiated a total liquidation protocol. He drained every single liquid asset the fund possessed, routed it through a cryptocurrency tumbler to wash the digital footprint, and dropped it into a corporate account in Grand Cayman under a fake name. I turned my attention to Desmond. He was sweating profusely now. The confident, arrogant swagger of the former professional athlete was completely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered animal. The handcuffs clinked against the metal bench ring as he shifted his weight. "He was planning to flee to Dubai tonight," I stated, my voice echoing clearly for everyone to hear. "That massive Christmas Eve party he was throwing at the mansion was nothing but a distraction. A flashy, loud diversion to keep all of you and his investors occupied and looking the other way. By the time the champagne ran out and the guests started asking where the host had gone, Desmond would have been in international airspace flying to a country with no extradition treaty to the United States." "I did not destroy your life, Mom. I just stopped his flight." Desmond shook his head violently, rattling the cuffs. "That is a lie," he shouted, looking desperately at my parents and then at Penelope. "She is making this all up. It is a witch hunt. Abigail has always hated me because I am successful, and she is just a bitter desk jockey. I was not fleeing anywhere. The transfer was a legitimate overseas investment opportunity, a highly classified green tech acquisition. You know how the federal government hates Black-owned businesses succeeding. They are profiling me, Penelope. You know I would never leave you. I am a family man. Tell them, Penelope, tell them I am innocent. My parents looked at Desmond, desperation warring with rising panic in their eyes. They wanted so badly to believe him. They wanted the comfortable, wealthy lie to be true. But Penelope did not defend her husband. She did not scream at me to stop lying. She stood perfectly still, staring at the floor. Penelope, my father urged, his voice trembling. Tell Abigail she is insane. Tell her Desmond was not going anywhere. When Penelope finally looked up, her face was completely ashen. Her designer makeup was smudged, but her eyes were wide with a terrifying, earth-shattering realization. She looked at Desmond, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. The silence in our small circle was deafening. Dubai, Penelope whispered, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. You were going to Dubai. Baby! Listen to me. Desmond pleaded, his smooth, charismatic tone cracking under the pressure. It is a lie. Abigail is just manipulating the data to hurt us. Penelope took a slow, unsteady step toward him. You told me the Dubai deal required an in-person representative, she said, her voice growing slightly louder, cutting through his frantic denials. You told me your business partner Marcus needed to go immediately to secure the contracts. Desmond swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his forehead. Yes, exactly. Marcus was going. It was a business trip for Marcus. Penelope let out a choked, devastated sob. But Marcus does not travel, she cried, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting clean tracks through her foundation. You told me Marcus was busy, so you asked me to use my personal credit card to book the travel arrangements. You said it was a tax write-off. Desmond. You told me I was buying a one-way first-class ticket for Marcus, but I put your passport information into the booking portal. Desmond froze. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His lies had collided violently with reality, and there was no way out. The realization hit my parents like a physical blow. The golden son-in-law, the man they had bankrupted my college fund to protect, was packing his bags and leaving them to face the federal government alone. He had used his own wife to buy his getaway ticket. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal settled heavily over the precinct lobby, and I simply watched as the family they had built on lies finally began to tear itself apart from the inside out. The silence in the precinct lobby was absolute, a stark contrast to the holiday chaos swirling outside. Penelope stared at her husband, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she reached out and grabbed the lapels of his sweat-stained shirt. The reality of his impending desertion was staring her right in the face, yet her mind violently rejected the truth. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being the envy of her social circle, the flawless wife with the wealthy, handsome husband. Admitting he was abandoning her meant admitting she was a fool. Desmond, look at me, Penelope pleaded, her voice rising in a desperate, breathy cadence. Just tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them you are booking a surprise anniversary trip for us. That is it, right? You were going to Dubai to set up our new vacation home. You were trying to protect me from the stress of the business. She turned frantically toward our parents, her eyes wide and begging for validation. Mom, tell Abigail she is wrong. Desmond loves me. He bought me that diamond tennis bracelet just yesterday. A man who is running away does not buy his wife diamonds. He is a family man. My mother Diane remained entirely mute. For the first time in my 30 years of existence, the matriarch of our family had absolutely nothing to say. The red zeros from her banking app were still burned into her retinas. My father Richard looked physically ill, leaning heavily against the booking desk as he calculated the utter destruction of his social standing. Neither of them moved to comfort their golden child. Desmond, please. Penelope sobbed, gripping his shirt tighter, shaking him slightly. Tell them the truth. Tell them we are a team. The desperate, pathetic nature of her pleading finally snapped the last thread of Desmond's carefully cultivated charm. The charismatic, booming laugh and the million-dollar smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating sneer that completely transformed his face. He looked down at the woman he had vowed to love and protect, and his eyes filled with absolute disgust. Get off of me, Desmond snarled. He violently shoved Penelope backward. The force of his push sent her stumbling across the scuffed linoleum. She tripped over the hem of her ruined silk gown and collapsed onto the hard plastic bench, gasping for air. You actually believe I wanted to take you with me? Desmond barked, his voice dripping with pure venom. You think I wanted to stay with a nagging, high-maintenance trophy wife once I had the cash secured? I have spent the last 5 years suffocating in this miserable family. You bleed money, Penelope. Your designer shoes, your ridiculous charity galas, your constant exhausting need to prove you are better than everyone else. Do you have any idea how much it costs to keep you happy? You drove me to accelerate the timeline of this entire operation just to keep up with your credit card bills. Penelope sat frozen on the bench, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and shattered. Do not speak to my daughter that way. My father finally managed to croak, taking a weak, half-hearted step forward. Desmond whipped his head around, fixing his furious glare on my father. Shut up, Richard. You are just as bad as she is. You happily took my money to fund your country club renovations. You never once asked to see a balance sheet or a profit margin. You just cashed the checks and paraded me around your rich, oblivious friends like a prized show pony. You were all so blinded by the illusion of wealth that none of you bothered to look under the hood. You were the easiest marks I ever conned. Desmond turned his attention back to Penelope, letting out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed unpleasantly through the lobby. I was leaving tonight, Penelope, Desmond stated, stepping as close to her as his handcuffs would allow. I packed a single bag, ordered the private car, and I was going to leave you here to deal with the fallout. You are too stupid to realize what was happening right in front of your face. You signed every paper I put on your desk because you were too busy planning your next cocktail party to read the fine print. He shook his head, a gesture of profound contempt. I was going to be sitting on a beach in Dubai tomorrow morning drinking champagne, while you woke up to federal agents raiding your precious mansion. The harsh reality of his words hung heavily in the air. Two tall, broad-shouldered federal agents who had been quietly observing the entire exchange from the security corridor stepped forward. Their presence signaled that the time for family drama was over, and the time for processing had begun. Desmond saw them approach, and the vicious, attacking energy instantly drained out of him. The predator realized he was caught in a trap, and his survival instincts kicked into maximum overdrive. His posture shifted. He straightened his spine, adopting the cooperative, compliant demeanor of a man looking to make a deal. Listen to me, Desmond said, raising his voice and addressing the two agents directly, completely ignoring his sobbing wife and my horrified parents. I know how this looks, but I am not the one you want. I was just the face of the Green Energy Innovation Fund. I shook the hands and attended the meetings. I did not design the laundering infrastructure. The lead agent stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest. He did not say a word, allowing the silence to draw Desmond out further. I can give you the mastermind, Desmond insisted, his voice trembling with a pathetic, desperate eagerness. I can give you the person who authorized every single fraudulent transfer, the person who holds the ultimate fiduciary responsibility for the entire operation. I have the documents to prove it. I will testify in federal court if you guarantee me a reduced sentence. Desmond raised his handcuffed hands and pointed his index finger directly at the plastic bench. He pointed right at his crying, devastated wife. Penelope signed all the wire transfers, Desmond declared, his voice ringing with absolute ruthless clarity. She is the legally registered Chief Financial Officer of the Green Energy Innovation Fund. Arrest her. The two federal agents did not hesitate. One of them pulled a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and stepped directly toward my sister. Penelope let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before, a shrill, suffocating gasp that sounded like a dying bird. She scrambled backward on the plastic bench, her ruined silk gown tangling around her legs, pressing herself flat against the cold cinder-block wall. My parents watched in absolute horror as the agent grabbed Penelope by the wrists and hauled her to her feet. The reality of the situation finally pierced through my father's thick skull. Desmond was not just going down, he was taking Penelope right down with him. She was the legally registered Chief Financial Officer. Her signature was stamped on every single fraudulent document, every offshore wire transfer, and every fake vendor invoice that moved the stolen money. She was staring directly down the barrel of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The transformation in my parents was instantaneous and deeply pathetic. They completely abandoned Desmond, leaving him chained to the bench to face his fate, and threw themselves at me. My mother, a woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at my clothing, my apartment, and my career, literally dropped to her knees on the filthy precinct floor. She grabbed the hem of my heavy winter coat, her perfectly manicured hands shaking violently. My father sank down right beside her, his custom-tailored trousers soaking up the muddy, dirty slush tracked in from the street. "Abigail, you have to stop this!" My mother wailed, tears destroying her expensive mascara and leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. "You are the lead investigator. You wrote the report. You can unwrite it. You can alter the audit, Abby. Just delete Penelope's name. Change the signatures. Make it look like Desmond forged them all without her knowledge. You have to save her." I stared down at the two people who had given me life, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow disgust. "You are asking me to commit federal perjury, destroy official government evidence, and risk my own freedom to cover up a $15 million Ponzi scheme," I said, keeping my voice steady and freezing cold. "You have done it before," my mother cried, her voice echoing shrilly in the crowded lobby, drawing the attention of several booking officers. "You took the fall for her DUI in high school. Do you remember, Abby? You let the police believe you were driving so Penelope would not lose her collegiate cheerleading scholarship. She is too fragile for prison. She is delicate. She would not survive a week in a federal facility. You are strong, Abigail. You are used to dealing with hardship. You can handle this. You can do this for her now." The absolute audacity of her request hung in the stale chemical-scented air. She was actually weaponizing the worst injustice of my childhood, a massive sacrifice they had bullied me into making when I was 17 years old, and trying to use it to guilt me into committing a massive federal crime. They had convinced me to take that DUI charge, putting a stain on my own record, simply because Penelope's comfort was always worth more than my future. I looked at Penelope, who was now weeping hysterically, as the agent secured the steel handcuffs around her wrists. Then I looked back down at my mother, groveling at my feet. "You banned me from Christmas dinner 4 hours ago." I stated my words, cutting through the chaotic noise of the police station with absolute precision. "You told me my boring stories would kill the vibe of your exclusive party. You mocked my career. You told me I was a negative, miserable spinster. And now you want me to throw away my federal license, my government pension, and my liberty to save a woman who would not even let me eat a piece of Wagyu beef at her holiday dinner? Absolutely not." My father scrambled to his feet, his face red with a mixture of intense shame and rising fury. He realized that begging was not going to work. The emotional manipulation that had controlled me for 30 years was completely ineffective. He needed a new strategy. He needed his ultimate weapon. Before my father could launch into another aggressive tirade, the heavy precinct double doors swung open. A man walked in wearing a cheap, shiny suit that smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. He carried a battered leather briefcase and held a digital tablet in his right hand. He was the bail bondsman my father had frantically called right after the raid, back when they still thought this was a simple misunderstanding they could throw cash at to make disappear. The bondsman assessed the chaotic scene, zeroing in on my father's expensive overcoat. "Richard Callahan," the bondsman asked, stepping casually over the shredded remains of my father's check on the floor. "I got your frantic voicemail. You need a bond for $1 million for Desmond. And judging by the crying lady in the silk dress, I am guessing you need another $1 million now for her." "Yes," my father snapped, aggressively adjusting his collar and trying to regain some semblance of his usual country club authority. "But my accounts are temporarily inaccessible due to a ridiculous banking error. I need you to post the full bail for my daughter Penelope right this second. I am putting up the family estate as collateral." My father puffed out his chest, leaning heavily on the one thing he believed made him completely invincible. The house in Connecticut. The sprawling $3 million property with the manicured lawns, the heated indoor pool, and the imported wine cellar. It was the absolute crown jewel of the Callahan family, the ultimate proof of their unquestionable superiority. "Put a lien on the Connecticut estate," my father commanded, waving his hand dismissively at the bondsman. "It is fully paid off. It appraised at over $3 million just last year. That should more than cover my daughter's immediate release. Draft the paperwork right now. The sleazy bondsman did not move to open his leather briefcase. Instead, he tapped the screen of his digital tablet a few times, his eyes scanning the glowing text. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face, revealing a row of nicotine-stained teeth. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that completely shattered my father's remaining dignity. The bondsman looked up, shaking his head slowly. "I cannot take your house, buddy." My father bristled, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "What do you mean you cannot take my house? It is prime luxury real estate. It is worth 3 times the bail amount." The bondsman tapped the tablet one last time and turned the screen so my father could clearly see the glowing official records. "I cannot take your house," the bondsman repeated, his greasy smile widening, "because you do not own it anymore." "What are you talking about?" My father barked, his voice cracking and vibrating with a desperate, unhinged kind of rage. "I own that property free and clear. It has been in my name for 25 years. You are looking at the wrong file, you incompetent hack." The bail bondsman just chuckled, entirely unbothered by the insult. He tapped the glass of his screen with a dirty fingernail. "The deed transferred 3 weeks ago, buddy. Foreclosure. The bank seized it. You are technically trespassing if you go back there tonight. They changed the locks on Monday morning." My father lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the bondsman's tablet. Diane let out a strangled gasp, clutching the pearls at her throat. The bondsman let out a sharp, unsympathetic snort, snatching his tablet back and shoving it into his battered leather briefcase. "I only take assets that actually belong to the people signing the contracts, Richard. You are carrying around a lot of expensive leather, but your net worth is currently sitting at less than 0. You are a liability. Good luck finding a judge who will grant bail tonight." The bondsman turned on his heel and marched out of the precinct, the heavy double doors swinging shut behind him, sealing my family inside their new reality. I stepped forward, pulling my own secure federal tablet from my heavy winter coat pocket. I tapped the screen, bringing up the financial autopsy I had spent the last 8 months meticulously compiling. "He is telling you the absolute truth, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his escalating panic. My father whipped around to face me, his chest heaving under his cashmere coat. "Explain this, Abigail, right now." I looked down at the highlighted documents on my screen, swiping through the digital records. Desmond secretly took out a third high-interest mortgage on the Connecticut estate 6 months ago, I stated, enunciating every single word so the reality would finally pierce through their thick armor of denial. He completely drained the equity to cover the massive gaping holes in his Ponzi scheme. When the balloon payments came due last month, he defaulted. The bank took ownership of the property 21 days ago. They have been quietly preparing the eviction notices while you were busy planning your holiday gala. My mother shook her head violently, her perfectly coiffed hair falling into her face. "That is impossible. Desmond could not mortgage our house. He is not on the deed. He does not own the property. He did not need to be on the deed." "Mom," I replied, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "He forged your signatures. And the bank accepted the paperwork without a second thought because you gave him comprehensive, unrestricted power of attorney to handle your investments." The color drained entirely from my father's face. He staggered backward, his knees buckling slightly until he hit the solid concrete pillar behind him. He slid down the wall, his expensive Italian wool trousers crumpling against the dirty, salt-stained floor. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a series of high-pitched, hyperventilating whimpers. The sheer magnitude of their ruin was settling over them like a heavy lead blanket. They were not just facing a temporary cash flow problem. They were entirely destitute. The grand sprawling estate with the heated indoor pool, the manicured gardens, the imported marble countertops, all the physical manifestations of their superiority were gone. They were homeless. For decades they had weaponized that house against me. They had hosted lavish catered dinners in that formal dining room, forcing me to sit at the far end of the table while they bragged loudly to their friends about Desmond's brilliant financial portfolio. They had looked down their noses at my modest, honest living, I remembered my mother visiting my apartment exactly once, refusing to sit on my sofa because it was not genuine leather, and telling me my lifestyle was a depressing reflection of my lack of ambition. They had called me a failure because I did not wear designer labels or drive a luxury European car. Now the sterile, chemical-smelling lobby of a downtown police precinct was the only roof they had over their heads on Christmas Eve. The wealth they had flaunted so aggressively was nothing but a fragile mirage constructed entirely out of Desmond's criminal fraud. My mother turned her wide, tear-filled eyes toward Desmond, who was still handcuffed to the metal bench nearby. "Desmond," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she crawled toward him on her knees. "Desmond, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not steal our home. We trusted you. We treated you like our own flesh and blood. We gave you everything. We drained Abigail's college fund for you. We lied to the police for you." Desmond leaned back against the hard plastic bench. The desperate cornered animal routine he had played for the federal agents just moments ago completely vanished. He looked at my parents broken and weeping on the precinct floor, and a dark, twisted amusement crept into his eyes. He did not look sorry. He did not look ashamed. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, maniacal, echoing sound that bounced off the cinder-block walls and made the nearby police officers turn around in disgust. "You gullible boomers practically handed me the pen!" Desmond sneered, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "You were so incredibly desperate to show off your NFL star son-in-law to your elitist country club friends that you did not even bother to read what you were signing." My father covered his face with his hands, letting out a ragged sob. Desmond leaned forward, straining against his handcuffs, his eyes alight with vicious pleasure. "You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else," Desmond spat. "You looked down on everyone who did not have a trust fund or a membership card. But you were the biggest fools in the room. I took your house, I took your retirement, and I took your dignity, and you smiled and thanked me for the privilege. I funded Penelope's ridiculous shopping sprees using your own stolen equity, and you praised me for being such a good provider. You just wanted the status." Desmond continued, kicking my father while he was down. "You wanted the bragging rights. You signed a stack of blank legal documents over a round of martinis at the clubhouse because you wanted everyone to see that you were doing business with a professional athlete. You signed away your entire lives because you cared more about looking rich than actually protecting your assets. It was the easiest con of my entire life." The silence that followed the bondsman's declaration was so absolute, I could hear the faint, rhythmic buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. My father stood frozen, his hand still hovering in the air where he had been aggressively gesturing toward his imaginary wealth. The color drained from his face in a slow, horrifying descent, leaving his skin a sickly ash gray. He looked down at the bondsman's tablet, his eyes frantically scanning the digital foreclosure notices, the bank seizure records, the undeniable proof of his complete financial annihilation. My mother let out a low, guttural moan, pressing her face against the dirty cinder-block wall. The realization hit them both with the destructive force of a localized earthquake. They were destitute. The sprawling Connecticut estate, the meticulously manicured gardens, the imported marble countertops they loved to flaunt over everyone else. It was all a mirage. Their entire identity, the foundation of their unchecked arrogance, and the very reason they had spent decades looking down on my honest government salary, had been completely hollowed out from the inside. They had nothing. They were homeless, standing in the middle of a police precinct on Christmas Eve with only the clothes on their backs. Desmond watched their total collapse from his spot on the metal bench. The sight of my parents' utter devastation did not elicit a single shred of remorse. Instead, a low, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. The chuckle quickly escalated, bouncing off the concrete walls until he was laughing maniacally, shaking his head as his handcuffs clinked against the steel ring. "You gullible boomers practically handed me the pen," Desmond sneered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You were so incredibly desperate to show off your NFL star son-in-law to your elitist country club friends that you did not even bother to read what you were signing." You gave me blanket power of attorney because you wanted to brag about my financial acumen during your stupid cocktail parties. You signed away your entire lives for bragging rights. My father covered his ears, sinking to the floor next to my mother, unable to bear the sound of Desmond's voice or the reality of his own foolishness. Desmond ignored them, his manic laughter subsiding as his eyes locked onto mine. The frantic energy of the cornered animal was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a predator assessing a new angle. He leaned forward, the chain of his cuffs pulling taut. "You think you have me beat, Abigail?" Desmond whispered, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial timbre. "You think you wrapped this all up in a neat little bow with your federal audits and your wire traces, but you only found the crumbs." I kept my face perfectly neutral, crossing my arms and staring back at him. "You froze the domestic accounts," Desmond continued, a smug, arrogant smirk twisting his features. "You locked down the shell companies in the Caymans. I will give you credit for that. But you missed the crypto wallets. You missed the cold storage. I have 8 figures sitting in decentralized, untraceable ledgers that your government computers cannot even begin to locate." He leaned closer, his eyes gleaming with desperate bribery. "I will make you a deal, accountant. You are a federal agent. I know exactly what your salary is. It is a joke. You work 60 hours a week just to barely afford rent in a city you cannot even enjoy. Let me walk. Leave the holding cell door unlocked. Turn your back for 5 minutes and I will wire you $2 million right now. Untraceable, clean cryptocurrency. More money than you will see in 2 lifetimes of kissing up to bureaucrats. You can walk out of here tonight, leave this pathetic family behind, and start a new life." He looked so confident. He truly believed that every single person on earth was just as corrupt, greedy, and morally bankrupt as he was. He thought my federal badge was just a price tag waiting to be met. Before I even needed to open my mouth to respond to his insulting offer, the heavy double doors of the precinct lobby swung open. A blast of freezing winter air rolled into the room, bringing with it a tall, strikingly glamorous woman in her mid-20s. She wore a sleek, camel-colored cashmere coat, designer stilettos that clicked sharply against the linoleum, and a pair of oversized sunglasses pushed up into her dark hair. Slung over her shoulder, completely at odds with her high-fashion appearance, was a massive, heavy-duty olive-green canvas duffel bag. Desmond's eyes lit up the second she walked through the door. His smug smirk widened into a triumphant grin. He honestly thought his getaway ride had arrived. Penelope, who had been sitting paralyzed in a state of shock, suddenly snapped her head up. Her tear-streaked eyes locked onto the glamorous newcomer. I watched the gears turning in my sister's head. She remembered the plane ticket to Dubai. She remembered the unaccounted-for funds. And now seeing this stunning, much younger woman confidently striding into the police station looking for her husband, Penelope jumped to the only conclusion her vain status-obsessed mind could comprehend. "You!" Penelope shrieked, her voice echoing like a siren. She scrambled up from the plastic bench, her ruined silk dress tearing further as she launched herself across the lobby. "You are the one he is leaving me for!" Penelope screamed, baring her manicured nails like claws. "You are the little tramp taking my husband to Dubai." Penelope charged with blind, irrational fury, fully intending to rip the young woman's hair out by the roots. The desk sergeant shouted a warning, reaching for his radio, but the situation was handled before he could even stand up. The glamorous assistant did not flinch. She did not scream or step back. As Penelope closed the distance, wildly swinging her arms, the young woman moved with terrifying, practiced precision. She sidestepped Penelope's clumsy lunge, caught my sister by the right wrist, and used Penelope's own momentum to spin her around. In one fluid, seamless motion, she drove Penelope face first into the cinder-block wall, pinning her arm painfully behind her back. Penelope let out a shocked, breathless yelp, completely immobilized against the painted concrete. Desmond leaped up from his bench, the chain of his handcuffs snapping taut. "Hey!" he yelled, panic finally fracturing his arrogant facade. "Get your hands off her! What are you doing? You are supposed to be getting me out of here." The young woman kept Penelope pinned firmly against the wall with one hand. With her free hand, she reached inside her tailored cashmere coat and pulled out a leather credential case. She flipped it open, letting a heavy gold federal shield catch the harsh fluorescent light. Special Agent Ramirez, IRS, Criminal Investigation. She announced, her voice ringing with absolute unshakable authority. Ramirez let go of Penelope, letting my sister slide down the wall into a crumpled, sobbing heap. With a swift, practiced motion, Ramirez unslung the heavy canvas duffel bag from her shoulder and dropped it onto the precinct floor. It hit the linoleum with a massive, echoing thud. The zipper fell open, spilling out a dozen leather-bound accounting ledgers, stacks of encrypted hard drives, and a handful of sleek black hardware wallets. "You were saying something about untraceable crypto wallets, Desmond?" I asked, stepping forward and looking down at the scattered evidence. Desmond stared at the duffel bag, the color draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. His jaw hung slack. He looked from the hardware wallets to the federal badge and finally to the woman he thought was his loyal subordinate. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction wash over me. "She is not your escape plan, Desmond. Agent Ramirez has been working as your executive assistant for 8 months. I planted her in your firm the day I opened the federal audit. We have everything." Desmond stared at this mountain of physical evidence spilling across the floor, his breathing ragged and shallow. The illusion of his impenetrable crypto fortress evaporated instantly. He looked at Agent Ramirez, the woman who had brought him his morning espresso, managed his confidential calendar, and meticulously documented every single illegal transfer he initiated over the last 240 days. Ramirez offered him a crisp professional nod, completely devoid of the deferential warmth she had weaponized to gain his trust. She stepped neatly over a scattered pile of encrypted hard drives and reached into the inner pocket of her camel coat. Her fingers produced a sleek titanium flash drive. She held it out to me without a word. "All the hardware wallets are seized and the recovery seed phrases are fully documented," Ramirez reported, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of a seasoned federal investigator. "But the real treasure is right here. I finished decoding his personal encrypted server an hour ago. He kept a shadow ledger of the shadow ledger." I took the drive, feeling the cold metal against my palm. "Thank you, Agent Ramirez. Excellent work." I turned my attention to the wall-mounted monitor above the booking desk, typically used to display holding cell camera feeds. I pulled a connecting cable from my bag, linked my tablet to the monitor, and plugged in the flash drive. The screen flickered black for a fraction of a second before flooding the drab precinct lobby with the blinding white light of a massive, meticulously organized spreadsheet. Row after row of illicit transactions, offshore account numbers, and redacted names illuminated the shocked faces of my family. My father was still sitting on the floor beside my mother, gripping his knees. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a mask of profound tragedy. He was fully leaning into the role of the aggrieved patriarch, the honorable businessman whose legacy had been destroyed by a rogue son-in-law. He did not yet realize that the crosshairs were moving directly onto him. "We are ruined," Richard moaned, rocking back and forth slightly, his hands gripping his expensive gray hair. "My reputation is gone. My standing in the community is completely destroyed. How could you let this happen to us, Abigail? You are a federal agent. You should have warned us. You should have protected your family instead of setting traps like a common spy. You let him steal my home." I stared down at him, feeling the familiar toxic anger flare in my chest. Even now, facing federal indictments and total bankruptcy, he was trying to shift the blame onto me. He was still trying to cast himself as the honorable victim and me as the treacherous, disloyal daughter who failed to protect his country club status. Every childhood memory of him dismissing my achievements in favor of Penelope's superficial victories rushed to the surface, fueling my absolute resolve. I swiped my finger across the tablet screen, scrolling past Desmond's initial embezzlement records and zooming in on a specific color-coded section of the ledger. I tapped a cell, enlarging it until a series of massive recurring wire transfers filled the wall monitor. "Desmond forged the mortgage, yes," I stated, my voice echoing off the concrete walls with lethal precision. "He stole the equity out from under you to cover his tracks. But let us not pretend you are just a tragic casualty of his deception, Dad." Let us drop the innocent victim routine right now. Richard stopped rocking, his head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening in sudden sharp panic. He looked from me to the glowing monitor, and I saw the exact moment the blood rushed out of his extremities. The bluster and arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a terrified hollow shell of a man. "What are you talking about?" My mother demanded, her voice shrill and trembling as she clutched at his sleeve. "Richard is the victim here. Desmond took everything from us. He stole our lives." I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father. He took the house, Mom, but Dad took a piece of the action. I tapped the screen again, highlighting the dates next to the recurring transfers in bright, glaring yellow. "You knew about the Ponzi scheme 3 months ago, Dad." The precinct lobby went dead silent. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. Penelope stopped sobbing, pushing herself up from the floor to stare at our father in absolute bewilderment. Desmond let out a low, dark chuckle, leaning back against his metal bench and watching the carnage unfold with vindictive satisfaction. He knew exactly what was coming next. "That is an outrageous lie," Richard sputtered, scrambling awkwardly to his feet. He swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the wooden booking desk for support. The sweat was beading on his forehead now. "You are fabricating evidence because you have always been jealous of this family. You have always resented my success. I am a respected businessman. I would never involve myself in a Ponzi scheme. I am a pillar of this community." "You did not involve yourself in the scheme?" I corrected, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You just profited from it. You realized the Green Energy Innovation Fund was completely insolvent 90 days ago. You noticed the discrepancies when you asked Desmond to funnel some early returns into your personal accounts. Most investors would have gone straight to the authorities. A decent man would have called the Securities and Exchange Commission to protect the elderly pensioners Desmond was robbing blind. But you are not a decent man." I swiped my finger across the tablet one final time, closing the spreadsheet and pulling up a high-resolution screenshot of a private email exchange. The text loomed enormous on the wall monitor, impossible for anyone in the room to ignore or deny. The header clearly displayed my father's private email address. "You did not call the authorities," I said, reading directly from the screen, making sure my voice carried to the federal agents standing by the doors. "You sent Desmond an encrypted email on September 14th. You told him you found the holes in his quarterly reports. And then instead of turning him in, you demanded a 15% hush money cut from the stolen retirement funds." My mother let out a horrific gasp, stumbling backward away from my father as if he were suddenly radioactive. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "You blackmailed him," I continued, my voice gaining strength and volume. "You extorted a federal criminal to keep up your own pathetic facade of wealth. You needed that 15% cut to pay your exorbitant country club dues, to keep leasing those luxury cars, and to maintain the illusion that you were a master of industry. You watched Desmond steal the life savings of teachers, firefighters, and nurses, and your only concern was making sure you got your slice of the pie to pay for your weekend golf tournaments and expensive cigars." Richard stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging open, his face twitching as he desperately searched for a lie, an excuse, a rationalization, but the evidence was staring him right in the face. The email contained his exact banking routing numbers, his personal demands, and his explicit threat to expose Desmond if the hush money was not delivered by the 1st of every month. The silence in the room was absolute condemnation. Desmond rattled his handcuffs, a vicious, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "You gullible boomers practically handed me the pen." Desmond laughed, shaking his head. "You were so desperate to show off your NFL star son-in-law to your country club friends that you did not even read what you were signing, and when you finally figured out I was bleeding you dry, you got greedy. You wanted in on the action. You dug your own grave, Richard." "You are not a victim, Richard," I declared, watching the last shreds of his fake, arrogant identity burn to ash. "You are a co-conspirator. You actively facilitated a federal crime to fund your country club lifestyle. And just like Desmond and Penelope, you are going to federal prison." The echo of my final word hung in the sterile precinct air, heavy and absolute. My mother, Diane, remained frozen on the salt-stained linoleum, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently where they rested against the dirty floor. She slowly turned her head, her gaze sweeping across the wreckage of her carefully curated decades-long illusion. She looked at Richard, the man she had worshipped and feared, the supposed titan of industry, who had financed her superiority complex. He was currently slumped against the booking desk, weeping openly into his cashmere sleeves, a pathetic, broken co-conspirator. She looked at Desmond, her golden son-in-law, the supposed financial genius, who was now glaring at the wall, his wrists shackled in federal steel. Finally, she looked at Penelope, her flawless favored daughter, who was hyperventilating against the cinder block wall, her designer gown torn, her face smeared with ruined mascara, facing her own impending indictments. The sheer crushing weight of her new reality descended upon her. The country club memberships, the charity galas, the imported caviar, the hushed, arrogant gossip over afternoon tea, it was all gone. Every single pillar of her existence had been kicked out from under her in the span of 20 minutes. She was no longer the envied matriarch of a wealthy Connecticut dynasty. She was the wife of an extortionist, the mother of an accomplice, and the mother-in-law of a scam artist. She was entirely irrevocably destitute, left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and the pearls clutching her throat. I watched the realization curdle in her eyes. I watched the frantic, panicked calculations race behind her expensive, tear-streaked makeup. Her survival instinct, honed by a lifetime of social climbing and narcissistic self-preservation, suddenly kicked into overdrive. She needed a lifeline. She needed a host. Her eyes snapped to me. I was the scapegoat. I was the disappointment who lived in a modest apartment and drove a reliable domestic sedan. I was the daughter she had mocked for earning a government salary. But right now, standing in this freezing police station with a federal badge on my belt, I was the only person in her bloodline who possessed freedom, a paycheck, and a roof over my head. The pivot was so immediate and so deeply sociopathic that it was almost breathtaking to witness. Diane scrambled up from the filthy floor, completely ignoring her weeping husband and her hyperventilating favorite daughter. She stumbled toward me, her arms outstretched, her face twisting into a mask of sudden, frantic maternal devotion. "Oh, Abigail!" she cried, her voice pitching into a hysterical, desperate register. "My sweet, honest Abigail!" She threw herself at me, grabbing my forearms with a vice-like grip. Her nails dug into the thick fabric of my winter coat. I stood perfectly still, a statue of solid ice, refusing to lean away, but offering absolutely no comfort in return. "Thank God I still have you," Diane sobbed, resting her forehead against my shoulder. "I always knew there was something wrong with them. I always knew Desmond was too slick, too secretive. And your father? I had no idea he was capable of this. I was a victim, Abby. I was completely in the dark. They lied to me. They kept me trapped in that house while they did these terrible things." She pulled her head back, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. She was attempting to project the image of a fragile, traumatized mother, completely oblivious to the fact that just hours ago, she had been swilling champagne paid for by stolen pensions. "You are the only good thing in this family, Abigail," she begged, her voice taking on a sickeningly sweet, placating tone. "You have always been the smart one, the responsible one, the one with a moral compass. I am so incredibly proud of you. I am so proud of the woman you have become. Please, you have to help me. Take me home with you, please. I can sleep on your couch. I will not be any trouble. We can start over, just the two of us, the honest ones." I stared down into her eyes. There was no love there. There was no genuine remorse, no actual pride in my accomplishments. There was only raw, unadulterated desperation. She was looking at me the exact same way a drowning woman looks at a piece of driftwood. I was an object to be used, a resource to be drained, just like the elderly investors her husband and son-in-law had bled dry. For 31 years I had craved her validation. I had begged for a fraction of the warmth she lavished on Penelope. I had achieved academic honors, earned a master's degree, and secured a highly competitive federal position, all while waiting for a single word of genuine praise from this woman. Now she was handing me exactly what I had always wanted, wrapped in the most toxic, self-serving lie I had ever heard. I did not feel vindicated by her praise. I just felt profoundly tired. I slowly reached down and peeled her clutching fingers off my coat one by one. I stepped back, severing the physical contact, leaving her grasping at empty air. "You do not have to put on this performance, Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "It is genuinely insulting to both of our intelligences." "Abby, no," she stammered, stepping forward again. "I mean it. I love you. You are my daughter." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my secure federal phone. I tapped the screen, unlocking it, and navigated to an audio file Agent Ramirez had securely transmitted to me earlier in the evening. Agent Ramirez was very thorough during her undercover assignment, I explained quietly, holding the phone up. She did not just monitor the financial ledgers, she monitored the office spaces, the private dining rooms, the holiday galas. When you are building a federal racketeering case, every conversation is relevant, including the ones you had 4 hours ago at your Christmas Eve party. Diane froze, the fake tears instantly drying up. I pressed play. The audio was crystal clear, enhanced by the precinct's high ceilings. The sound of clinking champagne flutes and soft jazz filled the lobby, followed immediately by my mother's distinct, arrogant, aristocratic drawl. "Thank God Abby didn't come." The recorded voice of my mother echoed through the police station, dripping with absolute malice and disgust. "Her miserable face ruins my appetite. She is always judging us with that pathetic middle-class morality of hers. I swear to God, sometimes I wish she wasn't even my daughter." The recording clicked off. The silence that rushed back into the room was suffocating. Diane's face turned a horrifying shade of white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute, undeniable proof of her hatred hung in the air, completely destroying her desperate performance. There was nowhere left to hide. There was no lie she could spin to talk her way out of this. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had spent a lifetime making sure I knew exactly how little I mattered. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. The tether connecting us had finally permanently snapped. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked her dead in the eye. "Your wish is granted." Diane stumbled backward as if struck by a physical blow, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer terrifying finality in my voice stripped away whatever desperate delusions she still harbored about manipulating her way out of this room. I turned my back on her, signaling to the precinct commander and the assembled federal agents that family hour was officially over. The tactical phase of the operation was now fully in motion. Agent Ramirez nodded sharply, gesturing toward the holding area. Two burly agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit detached themselves from the perimeter and flanked Desmond, hauling him up from the metal bench by his armpits. The reality of his situation finally breached his narcissistic armor. The arrogant, untouchable finance bro vanished entirely, replaced by a vicious, cornered fraudster. Desmond began thrashing violently against the heavy steel handcuffs, the chain biting into his wrists, as he tried to kick out at the officers. He screamed until his voice cracked, spewing a vile, unrestrained torrent of classist obscenities that echoed off the cinderblock walls. He blamed the government for stifling innovation. He blamed the system for being rigged against true visionaries who were just trying to disrupt the market. He screamed that the elderly investors he had robbed were pathetic, uneducated losers who deserved to be separated from their money because they lacked his elite intelligence. The agents remained entirely unbothered by his tirade. Their faces were stoic masks of professional indifference as they forcibly marched him toward the booking counter. Desmond demanded his high-priced attorneys, cursing the federal agents for earning government salaries, shrieking that he made more in a morning than they would see in a decade. The agents merely shoved him firmly against the processing desk, ignoring the sound of his custom-tailored suit jacket ripping at the shoulder seam as they patted him down for contraband. Across the lobby, another set of agents approached Penelope. The moment a female officer firmly grasped her upper arm to read her. Her rights, my sister, absolutely shattered. Her breakdown was a grotesque, surreal display of superficial vanity colliding with severe criminal justice. Penelope did not weep for her stolen future or the countless victims her husband had defrauded. She threw her head back and wailed about the physical indignities being inflicted upon her flawless aesthetic. She dropped her dead weight to the floor, thrashing wildly like a spoiled toddler denied a toy. Her ruined silk gown tore further along the seams as she writhed against the unyielding linoleum. She screamed hysterically that the gritty, salt-stained precinct floor was completely ruining the red soles of her limited-edition designer heels. Black streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her neck and soaking into her cashmere collar as she hyperventilated. She demanded that someone fetch her a mirror, shrieking that her wrists were far too delicate for federal steel. She yelled that her luxury lifestyle was being unfairly interrupted by jealous, bitter bureaucrats who just wanted to ruin her Christmas. When the agents attempted to gently but firmly lift her back to her feet, Penelope kicked her legs out, demanding her phone so she could call her publicist to manage the optics of her arrest. The officers swiftly secured her wrists behind her back, the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs finalizing her rapid transition from a pampered, untouchable socialite to a federally indicted inmate. She sobbed uncontrollably as they marched her away, mourning her scuffed shoes rather than her lost freedom. The coordinated takedown moved with terrifying efficiency. My father, who had been watching his daughter and son-in-law being processed, like common street criminals, suddenly realized the shifting dynamic in the room. Two heavily armored federal agents detached themselves from the main group and marched directly toward him. Their eyes were locked on his chest, and they were not carrying standard metal handcuffs. They carried thick, heavy-duty plastic zip ties, the kind reserved for immediate, non-compliant takedowns. Richard scrambled backward, his expensive Italian wool trousers slipping against the wet floor. He held his hands up in a frantic defensive gesture, his chest heaving under his cashmere coat. The agents did not slow down. They closed the distance in 3 long strides, grabbing Richard by the shoulders and spinning him around to face the dirty wall. My father tried to fight them. He planted his feet and shoved his elbow backward, a foolish, desperate attempt to resist federal authority. He threw his weight against the officers, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched collar as he struggled. "I am a foundational member of this community. I golf with the governor. I employ hundreds of people. You cannot treat me like some common street thug. I demand to speak to the chief of police right now. I will have your badges for this absolute outrage." The agents ignored his bluster completely. With a swift, practiced tactical maneuver, they swept his legs out from under him, bringing him down hard onto the unforgiving concrete floor. The impact knocked the wind out of his lungs in a sharp, wheezing gasp. They pinned his arms firmly behind his back, the heavy plastic zip ties cinching shut with a loud industrial ratchet sound that signaled the absolute end of his pathetic empire. The ultimate humiliation of a man who genuinely believed his wealth made him a god, now pinned to the floor by men earning public servant wages. Richard lay on the floor, his cheek pressed against the grime, panting heavily as the agents hauled him back up to his feet. His eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately searching for an exit, a legal loophole, or a friend in high places. But there was nothing. Then his frantic gaze landed on Diane. My mother was still standing near the center of the lobby, her hands pressed to her cheeks, paralyzed by the sheer velocity of her family's destruction. Richard's expression immediately twisted from sheer terror into a dark, vindictive rage. He realized he was going to federal prison, while she stood there unencumbered, playing the role of the innocent bystander. Spite, raw and venomous, completely overtook his survival instinct. If his ship was sinking, he was going to drag her down into the freezing depths right alongside him. As the agents began dragging him toward the holding cells, Richard dug his heels in and screamed back over his shoulder. His voice ripped through the quiet station, echoing with pure malicious intent. "Tell them the truth, Diane!" Richard roared, his face a twisted mask of furious betrayal. "Tell them you signed the fraudulent tax returns to hide the kickbacks. Tell them about the offshore shell accounts in your maiden name." Diane's breath hitched audibly, Her eyes widened in absolute unadulterated terror as the last drop of color drained completely from her face. Beside her, a tall federal agent slowly turned his head, reaching into his breast pocket and pulling out a laminated Miranda rights card. The tall federal agent held the laminated card up to the harsh fluorescent light, his voice ringing with absolute clinical detachment as he began to read Diane her rights. "You have the right to remain silent," he recited the words, cutting through the stale precinct air like a scalpel. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." My mother did not scream. She did not thrash or fight like Penelope, nor did she invoke her status like my father. She simply crumbled. The invisible strings holding up her aristocratic posture snapped all at once. Her shoulders slumped, her chin dropped, and she held her wrists out with a hollow, dead-eyed submission. The satisfying metallic click of the handcuffs securing her wrists marked the final definitive end of the Wilson family dynasty. I stood in the center of the lobby, surrounded by the sudden quiet that followed the storm. In less than 120 minutes, I had meticulously dismantled the entirety of my bloodline. The grand, sprawling empire built on deceit, extortion, and stolen pensions had been completely eradicated. Agent Vance, the lead FBI coordinator for the Joint Task Force, approached me. He had been quietly observing the tactical execution from the perimeter, letting Agent Ramirez and me handle the frontline confrontation. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod. "We need you in the side room," Wilson Vance said, gesturing toward a heavy steel door down the hall. "We have to verify the final asset seizure logs before transport." I followed him away from the booking desk and into a cramped, windowless interrogation room that the task force had commandeered for the night. The space smelled of stale coffee and ozone. Laptops covered a scratched aluminum table, their screens displaying real-time confirmations of frozen bank accounts, seized offshore trusts, and locked cryptocurrency ledgers. Vance handed me a thick stack of printed confirmation reports. I took a red pen and began initialing the bottom of each page, verifying that the asset numbers matched the financial autopsy I had spent the better part of a year assembling. "You completely gutted them," Vance remarked quietly, leaning against the edge of the metal table. He watched me with a mixture of professional awe and genuine concern. 30 years of systemic white-collar crime unraveled in a single evening. I have never seen an undercover operation executed with such surgical precision. I signed my name on the final seizure log and slid the stack back across the table. "They made it easy," I replied, my voice completely devoid of inflection. "Their arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. They honestly believed they were too smart to be caught, and they believed I was too stupid to catch them." Vance picked up the paperwork, but he did not immediately turn toward the door. He hesitated, shifting his weight. He looked at me, his seasoned investigator instincts, searching my face for the inevitable emotional crash. Most agents who worked cases involving family eventually broke down. The adrenaline would fade, and the sheer horror of sending their own flesh and blood to federal prison would crush them. "Are you okay?" Abigail Vance asked, his tone dropping the professional formality. "Truly, you just put your parents and your sister behind bars. Nobody would judge you if you needed to take a minute." I turned away from the table and walked toward the far wall of the interrogation room. A large pane of two-way glass stretched across the cinder blocks, offering a clear, unobstructed view of the precinct holding cells. I stepped right up to the glass, close enough for my breath to fog the cold surface. I looked at the 4 distinct cells. In the first, Desmond was pacing like a caged panther, kicking the metal bars and shouting into the void, still refusing to accept that his brilliant intellect had been outmatched. In the second, Penelope sat curled in a tight ball on the concrete floor, weeping hysterically over her ruined designer gown, her shallow universe completely reduced to the destruction of her vanity. In the third cell, Richard sat heavily on the metal cot, staring blankly at the wall, a ruined patriarch stripped of his golf clubs and his fake prestige. And in the fourth cell sat Diane. My mother was completely motionless, staring at her handcuffed wrists, with a vacant, hollow expression, finally forced to exist in a world where she could no longer buy her way out of consequence. I looked at the people who shared my DNA. I searched my chest for a flicker of regret, a shred of guilt, or even a basic pang of sorrow. I felt nothing. There was no grief. There was only the cold, hard, unyielding peace of a woman who had finally excised a massive, malignant tumor from her life. "I am perfectly fine, Vance," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the holding cells. "I mourned my family a decade ago. I grieved for the parents I never had when they chose to worship a criminal over loving their own daughter. I grieved for my sister when she chose money over loyalty. They died to me the day they kicked me out of that house for refusing to play their toxic games. Tonight is not a tragedy. Tonight is just paperwork." Vance stepped up beside me, looking through the glass at the ruined dynasty. He nodded slowly, accepting my absolute detachment. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a battered, thick manila envelope. "I believe you, Wilson Vance," said his voice returning to its crisp, professional timbre. "But there is one final piece of paperwork we need to discuss." I turned my attention away from the glass, looking down at the heavy envelope in his hand. "What is it?" I asked. "We already verified the accounts." "Agent Ramirez found this inside a false bottom in Desmond's personal office safe," Vance explained, holding the envelope out to me. "It was buried beneath the hardware wallets. It is a physical deed to a massive luxury estate in the Cayman Islands." I frowned, taking the envelope. A deed. Desmond's offshore assets were supposed to be entirely liquid. Why would he hold a physical deed to an island property? "That is exactly what we wanted to know," Vance said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "So we ran the registration numbers through the international database. Desmond bought the estate 3 years ago, right after he married your sister, but he did not put it in his name. He did not put it in Penelope's name, and he did not use a shell company." I slid my thumb under the flap of the envelope, pulling out the heavy embossed legal document. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, looking for the beneficiary line. Vance watched my face closely. "He bought the property in Secret Abigail, and it has your name on it." I stared down at the embossed parchment, my eyes tracking the heavy black ink that spelled out my full legal name. The document transferred absolute ownership of a secluded multi-million-dollar beachfront compound on Grand Cayman directly to me. My signature at the bottom was a flawless, terrifyingly accurate forgery. I ran my thumb over the notary seal, feeling the raised edges of a completely fabricated life. Vance watched me process the impossible document. He did not buy this as a gift. "Abigail," Vance said, his voice dropping to a grim, urgent register. "Desmond needed a legal vehicle. He needed to establish a highly valued, fully insured offshore footprint in your name to justify the next piece of paper in that folder. Look at what is underneath it." I reached back into the thick manila envelope. My fingers brushed against a dense, stapled contract. I pulled it out, laying it flat on the scratched aluminum table beside the forged property deed. The header featured the logo of a premier high-risk international underwriting firm known for insuring global executives. It was a comprehensive corporate life insurance policy. The coverage amount was staggering, printed in bold, undeniable numbers that seemed to burn into my retinas: $15 million. I scanned the primary insured line, my name. I checked the initiation date, June 14th, exactly 6 months and 10 days ago. My eyes tracked downward, skimming past the complex actuarial tables, the exorbitant premium schedules, and the accelerated payout clauses, moving directly to the primary beneficiary designation. Penelope Kensington. The air in the interrogation room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a harsh electric buzz that drowned out the distant, chaotic sounds of the precinct. I traced the forged signature on the policy, my mind racing backward through time, snapping seemingly disconnected events into sharp, horrifying focus. 6 months ago. That was precisely when Penelope had suddenly, inexplicably broken years of icy, arrogant silence to invite me to lunch. I remembered sitting across from her at that overpriced downtown bistro, thoroughly confused by her sudden, intense burst of sisterly affection. She had ordered expensive mimosas. She had reached across the table, squeezed my hand with manicured fingers, and insisted that I was working far too hard at my federal job. She had aggressively pushed the idea of a vacation offering to completely finance a private luxury getaway for me to the Caribbean to unwind. She had even offered to fly down with me for a secluded sisterly retreat to finally reconnect after years of distance. I had declined, citing an overloaded caseload and a lack of vacation days. My dedication to my job had unknowingly saved my life. The cold, hard peace I had felt just moments ago vanished entirely. It was replaced by a dark, visceral dread that settled deep in my bones, quickly hardening into absolute white-hot fury. Desmond and Penelope's cruelty was not merely social. It was not just about maintaining their superficial country club status, or hoarding luxury cars, or feeding their insatiable greed through Ponzi schemes and mortgage fraud. It was entirely predatory. They had meticulously constructed a fatal financial trap. The forged deed to the Cayman estate established me on paper as a high-net-worth individual with significant offshore assets, providing the perfect justification for a massive $15 million life insurance policy without triggering standard corporate underwriting alarms. The fabricated sisterly getaway was the execution plan. If I had not started my quiet, relentless audit of Desmond's shell companies, if I had accepted Penelope's sudden burst of generosity and boarded a private plane to that island, I never would have returned. They would have orchestrated a tragic, fatal accident at a secluded private estate, safely out of standard federal jurisdiction. A drowning. A fall from a balcony. Something clean and untraceable. And Penelope would have cashed a $15 million check while playing the role of the devastated, grieving sister for her wealthy friends. They were not just thieves. They were predators hunting their own blood. I looked at Vance. His jaw was clenched tight, his seasoned eyes reflecting the exact same chilling realization. He had seen the absolute worst of human nature, but the sheer, calculated depravity of this setup was evident on his face. He knew exactly what he was looking at. This was the motive, the method, and the payout for premeditated murder mapped out in black and white ink. I did not say another word. I picked up the thick insurance contract, my grip crushing the crisp edges of the paper. I turned on my heel and walked out of the interrogation room. The precinct lobby was a hive of controlled chaos, filled with the sounds of ringing phones, shouting officers, and the metallic clatter of equipment. But the noise faded into a dull, rushing static as I marched across the salt-stained linoleum. My boots struck the floor with heavy, purposeful intent. I bypassed the booking desk, bypassed the IRS agents cataloging evidence, and bypassed my father, who was still slumped on a bench in zip ties waiting for transport. I headed straight for the holding cells. Penelope was still crumpled on the floor of her cell. She was picking at the frayed tulle of her ruined designer gown, muttering feverishly to herself about her destroyed reputation and her scuffed shoes. She looked up as I approached her tear-streaked, mascara-stained face, shifting into a mask of pathetic, desperate expectation. She thought I was coming to save her. She thought blood would finally override justice. She thought her little sister was here to provide a lifeline. I did not slow down. I slammed the $15 million life insurance policy flat against the heavy steel bars with a violent, resounding crash. Penelope violently flinched, scrambling backward against the cinder block wall like a terrified animal. "You didn't just want me absent from Christmas," I stated, my voice echoing through the cell block with lethal, absolute certainty. "You wanted me dead." Penelope stared at the massive insurance contract pressed against the steel bars, her eyes darting across the bold, undeniable print. The $15 million figure reflected in her dilated pupils. The red-soled shoes and ruined designer gown were instantly forgotten. The full, crushing weight of the federal penal code crashed down upon her shoulders. She was no longer just an accessory to Desmond's white-collar embezzlement. This was attempted insurance fraud. This was conspiracy to commit murder. The realization snapped the last fragile threads of her sanity. She lunged forward, her manicured fingers wrapping frantically around the cold iron bars of the holding cell. She pressed her face against the metal, her breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps, smearing her makeup against the unyielding steel. "Abby, please!" Penelope choked out, her voice entirely stripped of its usual melodic arrogance. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure terror. "You have to believe me. I did not know what he was planning. Desmond handled all the paperwork. I just signed where he told me to sign. I thought it was a standard corporate policy for your new government position. I swear to God, Abby, I never wanted you hurt. I kept my eyes locked on hers, my expression an unreadable mask of ice. The desperation pouring out of her was pathetic, yet entirely predictable. Whenever accountability came knocking, Penelope always played the victim, shifting the blame to whoever was standing closest. For her entire life, our parents had allowed her to escape the consequences of her actions. She fully expected me to do the same. You bought the plane tickets, Penelope, I reminded her, keeping my voice dangerously low so only she could hear. You booked the secluded villa. You planned the itinerary down to the minute. You were going to ensure I was standing on that cliffside balcony when the railing mysteriously gave way. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you were just a naive housewife signing dotted lines. You were the executioner. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the bars tighter, shaking them as if she could tear the steel apart with her bare hands. She dropped to her knees, the torn silk of her dress pooling around her in the dirt. We are sisters! Penelope screamed, her voice echoing down the corridor and drawing the attention of the processing agents. Blood is thicker than water. I'll do anything, Abby. Anything. Just talk to the feds. Tell them I was coerced. Tell them I am innocent. Please, you have to save me. I stepped closer to the bars, invading her space, until only inches separated my face from hers. I watched the absolute panic swimming in her eyes, searching for a lifeline that I had severed years ago. There was no pity left in me. There was only the cold, sterile satisfaction of justice finally being served. Blood is thicker than water, but federal indictments are written in ink. I whispered my words, striking her like physical blows. I stepped back, adjusting the collar of my winter coat with meticulous precision. I looked her up and down, taking in the ruined hair, the smeared makeup, and the complete destruction of her carefully constructed aesthetic. Enjoy the jumpsuit, I added, my tone completely flat. Orange is totally your season. I turned on my heel and walked away, ignoring the guttural, hysterical shrieking that erupted behind me. Penelope threw herself against the bars, screaming my name, begging for mercy, pleading for a sisterly bond she had spent 30 years destroying. Her cries reverberated through the holding block, mingling with Desmond's furious cursing, creating a symphony of absolute ruin. I did not look back. I pushed through the heavy steel door, leaving the holding area and stepping back into the harsh fluorescent glare of the precinct lobby. The initial chaos of the arrests had settled into a steady bureaucratic hum. Agents were logging seized electronics into evidence bags. Analysts were cataloging the contents of my father's confiscated briefcase. The machinery of the federal justice system was operating with ruthless efficiency. I walked toward the exit, my mind shifting to the mountain of paperwork awaiting me at the field office. My role in the physical takedown was complete. The prosecution teams would handle the rest of the operation. Abigail, wait. I stopped, suppressing a heavy sigh. I turned toward the sound of the voice. Diane was sitting on a hard plastic chair near the precinct entrance. Unlike Richard, Desmond, and Penelope, she had not yet been processed into a holding cell. As a secondary conspirator whose crimes were primarily financial, the task force had deemed her a lower flight risk, choosing to detain her in the lobby while they finalized the seizure warrants on her personal accounts and drafted her formal charging documents. She stood up as I approached, her movements stiff and uncoordinated. The arrogant matriarch who had ruled Connecticut high society just hours ago was completely gone. Her shoulders were slumped, her expensive coat hung awkwardly on her frame, and her eyes were darting around the room with frantic, undisguised panic. I just spoke to my personal banker, Diane said, her voice shaking as she clutched a dead cell phone in her hand. They froze everything. The checking accounts, the savings, the mutual funds. I tried to call a taxi to take me to the townhouse, but the card was declined. The dispatcher said the bank rejected the charge. She took a step closer to me, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The federal agents who arrested your father, she stammered, her breath catching in her throat. They told me the marshals are currently at the estate. They are seizing the house, Abigail. They are taking the cars. They even took the keys to the Mercedes from my purse. I looked at her, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion wash over me. You signed fraudulent tax returns to hide millions in stolen retirement funds. Mom, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. The government is seizing everything purchased with that stolen money. That is how the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act works. You have absolutely nothing left. Diane stared at me, the reality of her total destitution finally sinking into her consciousness. The country club, the galas, the luxury vehicles, the sprawling mansion, all of it had evaporated into the cold winter air. She was standing in a dirty police station with no money, no home, and no husband to shield her from the consequences. Her survival instinct kicked in again, bypassing logic and completely ignoring the devastating interaction we had shared just 30 minutes prior regarding the secret audio recording. She looked at me, her eyes shining with a fresh, desperate gleam of pure narcissism and entitlement. I have nowhere to go, Diane whispered, her voice pitching into a fragile, helpless register. The hotels will not take me without a valid credit card. My friends will not answer their phones. They saw the news vans outside the estate. You have to help me, Abigail. Give me the keys to your apartment. You want to stay at my place? I asked, letting the sheer absurdity of the request hang in the cold, stale air of the precinct lobby. I tilted my head, studying the frantic, pathetic woman standing before me. You mean the apartment you explicitly called a depressing shoebox for poor people the last time I invited you over for Thanksgiving? Diane did not even have the grace to look ashamed. Her survival instinct completely overrode any capacity for embarrassment. She nodded frantically, her perfectly coiffed hair falling out of its pins and sticking to her tear-stained cheeks. I was wrong, Abigail. She babbled, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of desperate appeasement. I was so wrong to say that. It is a lovely apartment. It is practical. It is exactly what we need right now. I will be no trouble at all, I promise you. I can clean. I can cook. We can be a real family again, just you and me. I will do whatever you need, just please give me the keys. I cannot stay in a shelter. I cannot be seen on the street. My friends will be watching. The press will be watching. She reached out again, her hands trembling, palms turned upward, in a grotesque pantomime of a beggar. The woman who had worn imported Italian silk and hosted charity galas for the elite was now offering to scrub my floors just to maintain a fraction of her dignity behind closed doors. She was willing to completely erase 30 years of emotional abuse if it meant securing a warm bed for the night. I looked at her outstretched, shaking hands. I felt the familiar weight of my leather tote bag resting against my hip. I shook my head, a slow, deliberate movement that made Diane's breath catch in her throat. You cannot stay at my apartment, Mother, I said, my voice completely smooth and untroubled. Diane's face crumpled. A fresh wave of panic washed over her features, and she took a stumbling step forward, ready to launch into another hysterical plea. Please, Abby, you cannot leave me here. You are my flesh and blood. You owe me. Because I do not live there anymore, I stated, cutting off her impending tantrum with absolute surgical precision. Diane froze. Her mouth hung slightly open, her mind struggling to process this new piece of information. The frantic desperation in her eyes was briefly replaced by genuine confusion. She blinked, staring at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. You do not live there, she repeated numbly. But where are you living? You never told us you moved. You never tell us anything about your life. I ignored her complaints. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my designer tote bag. My fingers bypassed my wallet and my federal identification wrapping securely around a heavy ring of cold metal. I pulled my hand out, letting the object catch the harsh fluorescent lighting of the police station. I held up a set of heavy antique brass keys. They were distinct. They were unmistakable. They were not the lightweight modern aluminum keys of a standard city apartment. These were old, heavy, custom-forged keys attached to a monogrammed leather fob. Diane stopped breathing. Her eyes dropped to my hand and all the remaining color vanished from her face, leaving her complexion an ashen, sickly gray. She recognized them instantly. She had carried an identical set in her designer purses for the last 20 years. They were the keys to the massive wrought iron front doors of the Connecticut estate, her home, her palace, the physical manifestation of her entire aristocratic identity. "How do you have those?" Diane gasped, her voice dropping to a horrified, trembling whisper. She took a step back, wrapping her arms around her own torso, as if the temperature in the room had suddenly plummeted below zero. "Those are the estate keys. Desmond changed the locks last month for security. Only he and your father had the new sets. How did you get them?" I smiled. It was not a warm smile nor a forgiving one. It was the smile of a predator that had finally patiently cornered its prey after years of tracking it through the dark. "I got them from the property manager," I explained, stepping toward her and letting the brass keys jingle softly against each other. The sound echoed in the quiet lobby like a death knell for her lavish lifestyle. "Because when the private lender foreclosed on Desmond's third mortgage last month, my investment firm bought the debt." Diane swayed on her feet. Her knees actually buckled, and she had to grab the edge of the nearest plastic chair to keep from collapsing onto the linoleum. Her mind was misfiring desperately, trying to reconcile the daughter she had always viewed as a pathetic, poor public servant with the ruthless corporate reality now standing in front of her. "Your investment firm," she choked out, her eyes darting frantically between my face and the heavy brass keys. "What investment firm? You work for the government. You barely make a living wage. You do not have an investment firm. And Desmond did not have a third mortgage. We owned that estate outright. Your father paid it off 10 years ago." "Desmond told you he paid it off," I corrected, relishing the absolute destruction of her reality. "Desmond told you a lot of things, Mom. But Desmond is a degenerate gambler and a fraud. He took out a second mortgage to cover the initial shortfalls in his Ponzi scheme. When that money dried up, he quietly took out a massive third mortgage through a shadow lender to keep financing your country club dues and Penelope's shopping sprees. He leveraged the very roof over your head to keep up appearances." Diane began shaking her head back and forth, a rapid, frantic denial. "No. No, that is impossible. Richard would have known. Richard reviews the finances. Richard was busy demanding his 15% hush money cut from the stolen pensions," I reminded her coldly. "He did not care where the money came from as long as it kept flowing into his private accounts. None of you paid any attention to the actual paperwork. You were all too busy admiring yourselves in the mirror to realize the house was burning down around you." I took another step closer, forcing her to look directly at the keys. "When Desmond defaulted on that third mortgage 60 days ago, the private lender initiated a silent foreclosure." I continued, laying out the timeline with brutal clarity. "They wanted to liquidate the asset quickly to recoup their losses before the federal indictments dropped. They shopped the debt around to private equity firms. They needed a quiet buyer who could front the cash immediately without triggering a public scandal." Diane stared at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. "And you bought it." "I did," I confirmed, my voice ringing with total unyielding authority. "I used the capital from the private tech investments I made a decade ago. The investments you called a waste of time. The investments I kept completely hidden from this toxic family. I bought the debt, Mom. I bought the mortgage. I executed the foreclosure. I own the Connecticut estate. Every brick, every chandelier, every blade of grass on that 2-acre lot legally belongs to me." She opened her mouth, a silent scream of absolute devastation forming on her lips as she realized the true extent of her ruin. She was not just homeless. She was entirely at the mercy of the daughter she had spent 30 years trying to destroy. Diane stood there trembling, the polished veneer of the country club matriarch completely dissolving into a puddle of absolute panic. Her mouth worked uselessly, trying to form words that her shock-stricken brain could not supply. She finally managed to whisper that it was impossible that the bank would have notified them, that Richard or Desmond would have stopped it before it ever reached this point of total catastrophe. I watched her frantic denial with absolute clinical detachment. The precinct lobby bustled around us, officers booking suspects and answering phones, completely oblivious to the dynastic collapse happening near the vending machines. "Richard was a parasite, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any familial warmth. "He only cared about his percentage of the stolen pensions. And Desmond was far too arrogant to believe a shadow lender would actually call in a marker on his precious Connecticut estate." He thought he could stall the creditors with empty promises and forged collateral while he waited for Penelope to cash out my life insurance policy. He thought he had months to sort out his liquidity issues once I was dead. He did not. The moment the loan defaulted, it went to a blind auction. I set up a corporate proxy, a holding company completely insulated from my personal federal records, and I bid on the debt. Because Desmond had secured the loan against an asset that was heavily entangled in an active federal racketeering investigation, the paper was legally toxic. Nobody else in the financial sector wanted to touch it. I bought the entire mortgage for pennies on the dollar, legally, immaculately, and completely under the radar of your high society friends. I own the land. I own the structure. I own the custom Italian marble floors you bragged about at your charity galas. Diane gripped the back of the plastic lobby chair, her knuckles stark white against her meticulously manicured skin. "You cannot do this," she gasped, tears finally spilling over her lashes and cutting dark, jagged tracks of mascara down her pale cheeks. "You are my daughter. You were raised in that house. We gave you everything. You cannot just steal it from us." "I did not steal a single thing," I corrected her, my tone dropping to a hard, unyielding register. "I made a sound financial investment. Desmond signed the property away the second he used it to underwrite a criminal enterprise. I just happened to be the one holding the checkbook when the bank came to collect their due." Diane abandoned her grip on the chair and took a stumbling step toward me. She clasped her hands together in a posture of desperate, humiliating prayer. "Abigail, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "I have nowhere else to go. The accounts are entirely frozen. The cars are impounded by the marshals. Penelope and Desmond are going to federal prison. You cannot leave me on the street. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need me to sign. Just let me go home. Let me sleep in my own bed." I let her plead. I let the heavy silence stretch between us, allowing the sheer weight of her humiliation to settle over her trembling shoulders. This was the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure, a disappointment, an ugly blemish on the perfect Wilson family portrait. She had called my career a joke and my apartment a shoebox. This was the woman who had happily looked the other way while her husband and favored daughter plotted to murder me for a massive corporate insurance payout. She had built her entire identity on my perceived inferiority, and now she was begging for scraps. I reached back into my heavy designer tote bag. The leather was cool against my skin. My fingers slid past the brass keys and grasped a thick folded piece of legal parchment. "I didn't just freeze your accounts, Mom," I said, pulling the document out and holding it between my index and middle finger. "I am officially your landlord. And since you are 90 days delinquent on the mortgage payments Desmond stopped making to fund his offshore shell companies, we have a definitive, legally binding breach of contract." I extended my arm, offering her the document. Diane stared at it, as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. Her hands shook violently as she reached out and took the parchment from my grasp. She unfolded it, her eyes tracking the bold black lettering printed across the top of the page. The raised red seal of the Connecticut Superior Court gleamed under the harsh fluorescent precinct lights. "What is this?" Diane whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the police station lobby. I stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look up and meet my gaze. I wanted her to see the absolute unyielding finality burning in my eyes. I wanted her to understand that the daughter she had discarded was the one holding the axe. "It is an eviction notice," I stated, enunciating every syllable with crisp, undeniable clarity. "Fast-tracked and fully executed by a federal judge due to the asset forfeiture clauses linked to Desmond's criminal indictment. The court does not look kindly on properties used to leverage massive wire fraud and attempted murder." Diane looked down at the paper, her eyes scanning the dates and the stamped signatures with mounting dread. A fresh wave of absolute horror washed over her features as she read the execution timeline printed at the bottom of the page. "But this says it takes effect today." She choked out her breath, hitching painfully in her chest. "This says it takes effect immediately." I checked the heavy silver watch on my wrist. The glowing dial indicated it was precisely 5 o'clock in the morning. Outside the precinct doors, a heavy winter snowfall was beginning to coat the dark streets of the city, bringing a bitter, freezing chill to the air. "It takes effect at 8 o'clock this morning," I corrected her, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "On Christmas morning." Diane looked around the dirty, bustling police station, the bleak reality of her immediate future finally crashing down upon her. She had no money, no credit cards, no husband, and absolutely no allies left in the world. The only shelter she had left was currently being stripped from her grasp by the very person she had deemed worthless. I adjusted the leather strap of my tote bag, turning away from her ruined, tear-stained face. I had a mountain of federal paperwork to file, and I was entirely done dealing with the ghosts of my past. I looked back over my shoulder, locking eyes with her one last time to deliver the final crushing blow. "You have exactly 3 hours to pack your bags and get off my property." I turned my back on Diane's shattering reality, leaving her gasping for air in the sterile precinct lobby. Her panicked sobs and frantic demands faded into muffled silence behind the heavy reinforced glass doors of the federal building. I pushed through the exit, stepping out into the biting December chill. The transition from the claustrophobic, sweat-scented air of the police station to the crisp, freezing dawn felt like walking through a portal. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the sharp, clean air. It was a cleansing breath, the first one I had taken in 30 years, that did not carry the suffocating weight of my parents' expectations. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day. The world was supposed to be quiet, wrapped in a blanket of festive peace. Instead, the street ahead of me was ablaze with chaotic activity. A barricade of satellite trucks and news vans completely choked the avenue. Word of a massive, unprecedented federal raid on a high-profile Connecticut wealth fund had hemorrhaged to the press overnight. Desmond's $50 million Ponzi scheme was no longer a quiet, contained field office investigation. It had exploded into the lead story on every major national morning broadcast. Camera flashes strobed relentlessly against the dark pre-dawn sky, turning the steadily falling snowflakes into brilliant, chaotic bursts of white light. Reporters huddled in thick parkas, gripping their microphones like weapons, waiting for the first sign of official confirmation. Typically, undercover agents and forensic investigators avoid the media glare. We duck our heads, pull up our collars, and let the designated public affairs officers hand out sanitized, carefully worded press releases. We are trained to operate in the shadows, letting the prosecutors take the podium. Not today. Today required an entirely different protocol. I did not avert my gaze. I did not rush past the velvet ropes toward my waiting federal vehicle. I adjusted my winter coat, squared my shoulders, and walked directly toward the dense cluster of microphones hastily arranged on the precinct's icy concrete steps. The press corps surged forward the moment my boots hit the pavement. A tidal wave of shouted questions and thrust recording devices crashed against the metal barricades. I stepped confidently up to the podium, tapping the central microphone to ensure the feed was live. The chaotic shouting instantly died down, replaced by the unified, expectant hum of rolling cameras and flashing shutters. "Good morning," I began, my voice projecting across the frozen plaza with crisp, undeniable authority. "My name is Abigail Foster. I am the lead forensic investigator for the Joint Federal Task Force overseeing Operation House of Cards." The name Foster was deliberate. It was my legally changed surname, a professional identity I had adopted years ago to sever all ties with the toxic Wilson legacy. I had shed their corrupt brand the day I took my federal oath, refusing to let their arrogant shadow dictate my future. I looked directly into the lenses of the network cameras, ensuring every word landed with maximum devastating impact. Last night, federal agents executed coordinated multi-agency raids across 3 states, dismantling a highly sophisticated fraudulent enterprise disguised as a premier corporate wealth management fund. We have successfully arrested the primary architects of a $50 million embezzlement network. The perpetrators utilized phantom shell companies, forged underwriting documents, and illegal offshore collateral to systematically drain the retirement pensions of over 200 working-class families. I spoke flawlessly without notes, my delivery clinical and precise. I broke down the complex financial architecture into stark, undeniable facts. I explained how they preyed on vulnerable investors, funneling legitimate pension contributions through a labyrinth of Cayman Island accounts and dummy corporations. I exposed their reliance on fabricated high-yield returns to lure in new capital, outlining a classic Ponzi structure hidden behind the veneer of elite country club respectability. I cited the exact federal statutes violated, the specific international channels used for money laundering, and the precise timeline of our asset seizures. I laid bare the arrogant, sloppy mechanics of Desmond's entire operation for the world to see. I detailed how the task force had already secured the recovery and freezing of 90% of the stolen funds before the suspects even realized they were under investigation. By the time I finished the summary, I had permanently dismantled the illusion of Desmond's financial genius. He was not a Wall Street titan. He was not an untouchable mastermind. He was a cheap, careless thief caught and outmaneuvered by a superior intellect. Standing right there on the frozen concrete bathed in the glow of the media spotlights, I cemented my reputation as the top financial investigator in the country. The Wilson empire was dead, replaced by the undeniable reality of my success. The reporters immediately erupted into a renewed frenzy of questions, their voices overlapping in a desperate bid for a soundbite. A tall, seasoned journalist from a major financial network shoved his microphone closest to the edge of the podium, his eyes sharp with sudden recognition. "Miss Foster," he shouted over the deafening din of the crowd, checking a notebook in his hand. "The initial federal arrest logs released moments ago list the primary suspects as Desmond Richard and Penelope Wilson. Public records show that you were born into that exact household under that exact name." The journalist paused, leaning over the barricade. The heavy, loaded inquiry was designed to provoke an emotional breakdown. He wanted to capture the exact moment the stoic investigator crumbled under the weight of her familial betrayal. "Miss Foster, considering the perpetrators are your own family members, was this difficult for you?" The entire plaza went dead silent. The wind seemed to stop howling. Every camera zoomed in tight on my face, waiting for a crack in my professional armor. They wanted tears. They wanted a tragic, emotional narrative of a torn daughter forced by duty to lock away her own blood. They wanted a headline about a broken family. I looked directly into the camera, my expression an unyielding, unbreakable mask of absolute resolve. I thought about Penelope's forged insurance policy. I thought about Desmond's arrogance. I thought about Diane begging for the keys to the apartment she had mocked. Fraud has no family. I stated clearly, my voice slicing through the winter air like a blade. I simply took out the trash. The drive from the precinct to the Connecticut estate took exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes. I spent the ride in the back of a black luxury SUV flanked by 2 towering private security contractors I had hired specifically for this morning's extraction. I watched the urban sprawl of the city slowly give way to the manicured, snow-dusted estates of Fairfield County. The clock on the dashboard ticked relentlessly toward 8 o'clock. The morning sun was struggling to pierce through the heavy gray winter clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the sprawling properties. By the time my driver pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of Desmond's former palace, the reality of my absolute victory had settled deep into my bones. I did not need to buzz the intercom to request entry. I reached into my heavy tote bag, pulled out the antique brass keys, and pressed the electronic fob to override the security system. The massive iron gates swung inward with a smooth, silent glide. My vehicle crunched over the freshly fallen snow on the long, circular driveway, coming to a halt directly in front of the grand portico. Large, festive Christmas wreaths still hung on the windows, a stark and ironic contrast to the absolute devastation about to occur inside. I stepped out into the freezing air, my security detail stepping out in perfect synchronization behind me. I slid the heavy key into the custom lock of the massive oak front doors. The heavy tumbler clicked. I pushed the doors open and walked into the grand foyer. The silence of the mansion was immediately shattered by the sound of frantic tearing plastic and hysterical gulping sobs echoing from the grand staircase. I walked forward, my boots clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble, and looked up. Diane was half stumbling, half running down the sweeping curved staircase, dragging 3 massive black industrial garbage bags behind her. She looked absolutely deranged. Her designer silk blouse was wrinkled and untucked, her hair was a tangled bird's nest, and her mascara had smeared into dark, bruised circles around her panicked eyes. As one of the heavy plastic bags snagged on a wrought iron baluster, it tore wide open, sending a cascade of high-end luxury spilling onto the stairs. A limited edition Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag tumbled down the marble steps, followed by velvet Cartier boxes, diamond tennis bracelets, string upon string of South Sea pearls, and thick stacks of banded cash. She was treating 30 years of aristocratic accumulation like an apocalyptic smash and grab. Diane dropped to her knees, sobbing wildly as she frantically clawed at the spilled treasure, trying to shove the priceless items back into the torn plastic. She was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, murmuring desperately to herself about needing funds, about saving her jewelry, about liquidating the watches to survive. I snapped my fingers. My 2 private security contractors immediately stepped past me, their heavy boots thudding against the marble. They reached the stairs in seconds. One of the men firmly grabbed the tearing plastic bag from Diane's frantic grip, while the other stepped directly into her path, blocking her descent with the remaining bags. Diane shrieked a high-pitched sound of absolute terror and tried to snatch the Birkin bag back from the contractor's hands. I walked to the base of the stairs, crossing my arms over my chest. My expression was carved from ice. "Leave the bags," I ordered, my voice echoing coldly through the cavernous foyer. Diane froze, her hands hovering mid-air. She looked down at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "You cannot take these," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "These are mine. Desmond bought these for me for our anniversaries. They are my personal property. You are a monster." I shook my head slowly, feeling absolutely no pity for the sobbing wreck of a woman cowering on the stairs. I stared directly into her panicked eyes. "Those were purchased with stolen investor funds," I stated, laying down the unyielding reality of her situation. "They belong to the Federal Seizure Unit now. Every single diamond, every ounce of gold, and every designer label in those bags was bought using the drained pension accounts of retired teachers and factory workers. You do not get to pawn stolen Cartier to fund your escape." My security contractors smoothly confiscated the remaining garbage bags, pulling them easily from Diane's weak, trembling grasp. She lunged forward, but the taller contractor held up a massive, unyielding arm, forcing her to step back. "You are leaving this property with exactly what you are wearing," I told her. "The clothes on your back, nothing else." I gestured toward the front door. My men flanked Diane, leaving her no physical avenue of escape. They gripped her by the upper arms, not hard enough to bruise, but firmly enough to completely strip her of any remaining agency. They marched her down the remaining stairs, across the marble foyer, and directly toward the exit. I walked over to the hall closet, grabbed a single basic winter coat, and tossed it onto the porch. The contractors pushed Diane out the open front doors. She stumbled out into the biting morning air, her knees buckling slightly, as her bare feet in thin silk slippers hit the freezing snow-covered stone of the grand portico. The contractors immediately stepped back inside and took their positions behind me. Diane stood shivering in the biting wind, wrapping her arms around her trembling torso. The snow was falling heavier now, catching in her disheveled hair and melting against her pale skin. She looked entirely broken. The echo of that heavy lock tumbling into place became the defining soundtrack of the next 6 months. It was the sound of a vault slamming shut on an era of toxic manipulation and the firing pistol for a sequence of absolute merciless justice. The federal indictments hit the docket with the force of a runaway freight train. There were no prolonged dramatic trials for the Wilson family. I had handed the United States Attorney's Office a completely bulletproof, hermetically sealed forensic autopsy of their entire financial operation. Desmond's astronomically expensive defense lawyers took one look at the offshore routing matrices I had decrypted and immediately advised him to surrender. He stood before a federal judge, his custom-tailored suit hanging loosely off his rapidly deflating frame, and listened in stunned, breathless silence as he was handed a 20-year sentence in a maximum-security federal penitentiary. The judge explicitly cited his predatory targeting of elderly pensioners as grounds to deny any chance of early parole. He was led away in handcuffs, his legacy permanently reduced to a 9-digit inmate identification number. Penelope fared no better. She attempted to play the victim, unleashing a torrent of perfectly rehearsed tears during her sentencing hearing, claiming she was merely a naive, manipulated pawn in her father's grand scheme. The prosecutor responded by projecting her forged signatures on my fraudulent life insurance policies onto a massive courtroom screen displaying her calculated malice for the jury. Her fake sobs abruptly stopped. The gavel came down, gifting her 7 years in a federal correctional institution. She traded her imported Italian silks and designer purses for standard-issue khaki jumpsuits. Richard, ever the self-serving coward, attempted to strike a last-minute immunity deal by offering to testify against Desmond. The prosecution laughed him out of the room. I had already provided them with the digital ledgers, proving Richard actively orchestrated the tax evasion protocols. He received 5 years for complicity and wire fraud, weeping openly as the bailiff snapped the iron cuffs around his wrists. Diane managed to avoid federal prison. She had been too intentionally ignorant, too insulated by her own vanity to actually sign any of the incriminating documents. But the universe delivered a punishment far more exquisitely tailored to her specific flaws. She was thrust into the very existence she had spent her entire life mocking. Today, Diane resides in a cramped 300-square-foot studio apartment in a decaying high-crime industrial sector of the city. The peeling linoleum floors and rattling radiator are a far cry from the heated marble she once walked upon. To survive, to simply keep the lights on and feed herself, she works as a cashier at a massive, unforgiving discount grocery warehouse. For 8 hours a day, she stands under harsh, flickering fluorescent lights, wearing a hideous, oversized polyester uniform vest. Her once perfect manicures are chipped and ruined by handling damp produce and scanning endless rows of generic canned goods. She endures the shouting of impatient customers and the strict, unyielding reprimands of a teenage shift manager. Every scan of a barcode is a relentless ticking reminder of her permanent fall from grace. As for the Connecticut estate, I did not keep it. Living within those walls would have been like living inside a mausoleum of bad memories. Instead, I stood on the sidewalk one brisk Tuesday morning with a hot cup of coffee and watched a crew of heavy demolition contractors bulldoze the entire mansion to the ground. The wrecking ball smashed through the grand portico, pulverizing the sweeping staircase where Diane had wept, reducing the opulent symbol of their arrogance into a mountain of splintered drywall and shattered brick. I watched the dust cloud rise and felt entirely weightless. Once the 2-acre lot was leveled and cleared of debris, I sold the prime commercial real estate to a luxury retail developer for triple its original appraised value. I took that massive capital injection, combined it with the liquid assets I had securely invested years ago, and moved to Manhattan. I resigned from my government position. The public sector had trained me, but the private sector was where I could truly leverage my intellect. I opened Foster Forensics, an elite boutique corporate investigation and financial recovery firm. I built a team of the most ruthless, brilliant forensic accountants in the country. We do not handle petty tax disputes. We are contracted by international conglomerates to hunt down corporate espionage, dismantle hostile takeovers, and trace billions in hidden assets. I transformed myself from a discarded, targeted daughter into an apex predator in the global financial sector. Now, exactly 6 months to the day since I shut that oak door, I sat behind a massive slab of polished obsidian that served as my desk. My stunning corner office sat on the 52nd floor of a sleek glass skyscraper, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the New York City skyline. The morning sunlight caught the sharp modern angles of the room, highlighting a space earned entirely through my own grit and absolute competence. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, reviewing a digital dossier on my tablet. The soft, melodic chime of my intercom interrupted the quiet hum of the city far below. I pressed the silver button, my eyes never leaving the financial data on the screen. Yes, Sarah. Miss Foster. My assistant's crisp professional voice filled the room. The executive board from Vanguard Holdings has arrived. They are waiting for you in the primary conference room. They are extremely eager to discuss the terms of your retainer for the upcoming corporate audit. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute power and total control over my own destiny. Excellent. Tell them I will be right in. Completely severed from the opulent reality she had worshipped for 3 decades. She had no wealth, no status, and no family left to exploit. She stared at me standing in the warm, well-lit foyer of the estate she used to rule. Her lower lip quivered uncontrollably. "Where am I supposed to go?" Diane asked, her voice barely a hollow, pathetic whisper over the howling winter wind. I looked at the shivering woman standing in the freezing snow. I thought about the text message I had received when I was stranded at the airport, desperately needing a ride from my family, only to be met with cold indifference. I smiled, letting the absolute perfect justice of the moment wash over me. "I don't know," I replied smoothly. "Try an Uber." I grabbed the brass handles and pulled the heavy oak doors shut, the massive lock clicking into place with a satisfying permanent thud. I stepped away from my obsidian desk, the satisfying rhythmic click of my heels against the polished hardwood, echoing my absolute certainty. The Vanguard Holdings executives had been formidable negotiators, but their extensive federal compliance issues required the exact brand of surgical financial extraction my firm specialized in. They had come to my office seeking the absolute best, and I had just delivered a masterclass in corporate forensic strategy. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass doors of the primary conference room. The atmosphere inside was instantly electric, vibrating with the kind of triumphant buzzing energy that only follows a massive hard-fought victory. The ink on the Vanguard contract, a staggering multi-million-dollar federal oversight agreement that would secure our firm's dominance for the next decade, was barely dry. My core team was already gathered around the massive mahogany table, their faces flushed with adrenaline and pride. These were not inherited sycophants or country club cronies handed positions through corrupt nepotism. They were the sharpest forensic accountants, the most ruthless legal minds, and the most dedicated, unyielding investigators in Manhattan. I had handpicked every single one of them based on merit and grit. They erupted into genuine roaring applause the second I crossed the threshold. Sarah, my brilliant assistant, was already popping the cork on a vintage bottle of imported champagne, the joyous pop ringing out like a gunshot of victory. Standing at the head of the table, radiating quiet pride and unshakable support, was David. He was a brilliant federal prosecutor, the very same relentless legal mind who had worked flawlessly alongside me to secure the airtight indictments against Desmond and Penelope. He stepped forward and handed me a crystal flute, his eyes reflecting the deep, unconditional respect I had spent my entire life searching for. David did not view my ambition as a threat. He did not ask me to soften my edges, lower my voice, or make myself small to accommodate a fragile masculine ego. He championed my intellect. We were equal partners, a formidable unit built on mutual trust, shared values, and a mutual dedication to absolute justice. He wrapped his free arm around my waist, pulling me close to press a warm, grounding kiss to my temple. I took a long, deliberate moment to look around the room at the glowing, triumphant faces of my colleagues. They were raising their glasses, offering heartfelt toasts to my leadership, my vision, and our collective success. A profound, anchoring warmth spread through my chest, completely dissolving any lingering residual chill from my toxic past. For 30 years, I had agonized over my inability to fit into the suffocating, corrupt mold of my former dynasty. I had exhausted myself trying to earn the love and approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of offering it, people who viewed empathy as a weakness and exploitation as a birthright. I had let them convince me that I was flawed, that my relentless drive for truth was an ugly defect. Looking at David and my incredible team, the absolute truth finally settled over my shoulders, heavy and comforting. Family is not defined by shared DNA, legal obligation, or historical proximity. Family is not a group of people who demand you shrink yourself for their comfort or force you to underwrite their delusions of grandeur. Family consists of the people who recognize your inherent worth, who support your relentless grind, and who stand firmly beside you when the stakes are at their absolute highest. They are the people who applaud your victories instead of attempting to steal them. I raised my glass high to meet theirs, the fine crystal chiming with a bright, clear resonance that echoed through the high-rise suite. We drank to the Vanguard contract, to the unstoppable future of foster forensics, and to the absolute exhilarating freedom of defining our own destinies. As the celebration swelled around me with genuine laughter and the cheerful clinking of glasses, I set my drink down on the polished table. My personal cell phone rested next to the freshly signed corporate contract. The screen suddenly lit up, cutting through the ambient joy of the room with a harsh, glowing notification. It was a text message from an unsaved number, but I recognized the frantic, pleading cadence and the underlying entitlement immediately. Please, Abby. I am so sorry. I need help. They are cutting my hours at the store and the manager hates me. I cannot make rent this month. You have so much, please. I stared down at the glowing words illuminating the dark screen. A year ago, a message exactly like that would have sent me into a violent spiral of guilt, anger, and deeply conditioned obligation. I would have agonized over my duty, tearing myself apart in an agonizing tug of war between self-preservation and the ingrained toxic loyalty I had been brainwashed to feel. I would have debated sending money just to make the whining stop. Now, staring at the desperate plea of the woman who had happily offered me up as a sacrificial lamb for a payout, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no blinding rage. There was no lingering pity. There was no residual sadness. There was only the vast, peaceful emptiness of complete, irrevocable detachment. Diane was a stranger to me now, a pathetic echo of a life that simply no longer existed. With a serene, entirely untroubled smile, I picked up the phone. I did not type a response. I did not hesitate. I simply pressed my thumb against the screen and hit block caller. The display immediately went dark instantly and permanently severing the final fraying thread to a past I had completely outgrown. I set the device face down on the table, picked up my champagne, and turned my back on the silence. I walked effortlessly back into the vibrant, supportive embrace of my real family, ready to conquer whatever came next. Abigail's journey powerfully illustrates that biology does not automatically dictate family. True loyalty is earned through mutual respect, unwavering support, and shared values, not extracted through manipulation or toxic obligation. When we successfully release the desperate need for validation from those committed to misunderstanding us, we create space for genuine connections. Detaching from a destructive past is never a failure of love, but rather an ultimate act of personal survival. You always have the absolute right to walk away from environments demanding your diminishment. What steps have you taken to protect your peace? Please share your experiences and comment below.